Ladies and gentlemen, today is March 30th, 2025, and we are here to talk about the world, current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of Will Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello?
Yo.
Hang on. There we go.
Hang on.
Hear you. What's up?
Not much. Snowing outside. Played some Dota. I've made progress in my solo honor mode run. Played some Dota. I'm working on a new hero in that game, so that's been a good time. And I saved the hostages in the submersible. I think all but one or two. So the Gondians were very happy to be saved. And Omelum, the mind flayer, is randomly down there, who's a friendly one to you.
Yeah, he's probably the easiest one to save.
Yeah, he has a teleport to submersible button.
Pretty handy.
Mm-hmm. But I called it the anxiety boat fight because you're underwater in a place that's about to be destroyed in a few number of turns, so there's a time urgency, and just the way that you're gonna die is like very exciting. And then the fish people who jump out of the water there, they increase in number as the turns progress, and they also have an ensnare ability, which prevents you from running to the submersible. So that's an extra problem. I don't know if that's an honor mode specific, but ensnare is very nasty. There was one NPC lady who's like restrained. You help her out, and then one of the fish people threw a net at her to ensnare, but they missed. She dodged it, and then she was able to just barely get out on the last turn. Yeah. But the story reward is really good, because then the husband of that character was like, oh my gosh, did you save her? And it's like, yeah, actually, she just barely dodged a net. She would have died. She's a keeper.
Well played. That is pretty... I had to save Scum a lot in my first playthrough to get that done.
Mm-hmm.
So full credit for pulling it off in honor mode.
Yeah. I did read a guide before I started, just to get a sense of what their plan was, and splitting up the characters is something that you have to do to get all the hostages or close to all of them, because Omelum and Duke Ravengard and a bunch of the Gondians are in opposite corners from each other. So ideally, all of your characters can deal with 2 fish people at a time by themselves. Yep, that was good. And then...
Did you get Duke Ravengard while you were there?
Yes, and that was the first time I've seen the conversation with him after, because I haven't saved him before.
Gotcha. What did you think?
It was good. First, he's like a judgy dad or whatever, and then you mind flayer parasite, get them to share the story, and then he's like, oh damn, sorry son, you're trying your best. So that was cool. I hadn't seen that outcome before. The devil lady does try to kill him by summoning some exploding bugs, and then also
That's
holding...
why I wanted to take Sanctuary when I thought we were going to do that.
Oh, you were going to cast that on him.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's a handy way to get around the route.
Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah, it's been a, I think, fairly interesting week. Actually, my dad had a question for you, and my brother had a question for you.
Oh, really?
Yeah. My dad's question was just, generally, what's the read on the current Prime Minister of the UK? Because I think there's been a new dude in for a bit. I don't really know much about them either.
I guess it partly depends on your perspective. Conservatives don't like him, obviously. Especially if they're Nigel Farage-aligned Reform UK type people. But even people on the left are not really thrilled. I mean, the trouble that Starmer has is the same trouble that pretty much every British government has had for, I want to say, the past 20-some years, which is that the UK economy is just fundamentally not that healthy. it struggles with low investment, low productivity, low growth, and all of those are sort of tied into each other. They kind of cause each other, so to speak. And no British government in that time frame has been able to kind of solve that fundamental underlying problem. And the trouble is that the symptoms of those problems are the kinds of symptoms that are very notable, right? For example, the British economy is not such that the British government can spend a lot of money on stuff that's popular or even necessarily stuff that's needed. And the result of that is that key constituents in the British political system are basically permanently upset at whoever is in power at a given time because they just can't deliver on their promises to them. If you're kind of more of a left-aligned voter, you want the government to spend more on the people, on welfare, on this kind of stuff, but the money's not really there. But even if you're a conservative voter and you want the government to spend less, you still want it to spend on things that are important to the economy, like infrastructure, modernization, and you also want the government generally, if you're most conservatives anyway, you want the government to spend money on defense so that the country can be at least relatively self-sufficient. And the British government can't spend on that stuff either. And so the result is that no government in decades has really managed to be popular. Boris Johnson maybe came the closest because he was more of a populist figure, but even he was unable to implement any kind of transformative change that was able to kickstart the economy or otherwise sort of rejuvenate the public's faith in the government, if not just the public's general faith in the country as a whole. And until somebody comes up with a solution for those kind of key underlying problems, probably every subsequent government in Britain going forward is going to suffer from mediocre popularity at best. And so Starmer is no different in that regard. He has kind of shifted away from what would you want to call it, the Jeremy Corbyn mode of leftism that had kind of been dominant in the Labour Party for a while. Not very long, mind you. Labour famously was very much like a borderline centre-right party for a long time in the UK. That was sort of the Blair years in the late 90s and early aughts. And then they just kind of didn't have a platform, really. They famously had Gordon Brown as prime minister, quite possibly the blandest politician I've seen ever in my lifetime. He just didn't really know what to do or where to go or how to handle the UK's unique problems. And so, his failure to deal with those problems augured in more than a decade of conservative rule, which was itself not especially successful, but one of the results of that sort of period of austerity under the Conservatives was a kind of minor radicalization of the left that fully manifested in the far left of the Labour Party reacquiring control over the party in the form of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. And so for a couple of years, he kind of ran things, and then they had a big election where the Conservatives were very unpopular, and it was expected Labour would do at least decently, and they flopped. The Conservatives were able to really nail Corbyn to the wall on a number of issues that were unpopular with the broader public. And so that kind of spelled the end of the far left's term in control of the Labour Party. And so since then, centrists like Keir Starmer have come back in and moderated the party's platform. That's meant, being more moderate on social issues, economic issues, basically the whole gamut of stuff. To the point where the government's economic policy now is not that different than the Conservatives' policy from 10-some years ago, which is that they want a degree of austerity, they want to shrink the national debt, but they want to do it without imposing too much pain. They're kind of trying to have their cake and eat it too. They want to restrict spending as much as possible, but they also want to spend on items of core interest, that being especially infrastructure spending. They want to try to use that to improve what is generally called a crumbling, quote unquote, crumbling infrastructure in order to try to rejuvenate the economy. I'm not a big fan of the, crumbling infrastructure narrative that is frequently trot out in politics. It's not really a way to rejuvenate the economy. Really, you should just be doing baseline maintenance of infrastructure, regardless of economic conditions. And even if you kind of delay maintenance for a long time and then spend a bunch on it, that's not going to rejuvenate the economy. That is by and large going to be a lateral move, because a lot of that money is just going to be replacing or repairing stuff, that is to say infrastructure that you already have and that is already providing economic dividends. So that's preserving economic activity, not creating new economic activity. And it's really creating new economic activity that is needed in order to generate economic growth for the UK. So infrastructure spending is useful, but it's not going to change the economic course of the UK right now. And Starmer, unfortunately, hasn't, well, I should say Starmer's administration, unfortunately, has not been able to really generate a broader vision for how to generate growth in the UK. And I don't really blame him for that. I don't think that's an ideological failing. There's been pretty much every kind of ideology under the sun at this point over the past 10 years that's at least electable that has been in power in the UK, and none of them have been able to solve this. And I honestly don't really know if there is a solution at this point. That kind of gets into a conversation about just the UK economy in general. That it's struggled so much with that underlying productivity problem. And that's not really a problem that the state can solve. To a degree, the issue is that the UK has a gold-plated economy. This is sort of the end state for a lot of successful economies. You can see this going all the way back to the early modern period of European history, where you had city-states like the Italian city-states, or even city-states in the Low Countries, which were very successful for a long period of time, but then eventually declined because lower-cost producers of the goods that they sold eventually took their market share. And so the old leaders remained relevant economic actors in Europe, but increasingly they focused on the premium end of whatever market they had been producing in, which meant that there was relatively less employment, relatively less overall profit being made, and just in general that the city over time became less and less economically dynamic and more niche. Again, that's something that's played out multiple times just throughout European history, and you can kind of see it now on a larger scale, on a national scale, or even a continental scale in the case of the United States, over the past couple decades in the West. Because we had a lot of major manufacturing industries that dominated their particular spheres, but eventually low-cost producers abroad undermined market share. And so the result is not that those manufacturing industries and firms disappeared completely, but that they began to specialize in very premium niches in those markets. Sort of the high-end, high-value, high-cost, high-revenue, well, maybe not high revenue, but high-profit niches in those markets that the newer producers were not sufficiently experienced to compete in yet. And so the result of that is not a complete collapse in manufacturing, but certainly a collapse in manufacturing employment, a collapse in manufacturing as a percentage of GDP. Now, the services sector has moved in and soaked up some of that wayward labor, some of that unemployment. And actually, the UK and the US have been very, very good at generating economic activity in their respective tertiary sectors. In fact, those are some of the top countries in the world in a whole range of tertiary sector economic industries. But the trouble is that those don't really generate jobs for a lot of people with just high school level educations. I'm not sure what the equivalent in the UK would be. But in the UK, that manifests as stagnation or even severe economic difficulties in what are generally second or third tier cities like Birmingham, Manchester, etc., more in the middle and northern part of the country, where tertiary sectors are not nearly as prominent. Those have been major manufacturing centers, and when manufacturing declined, those cities went with them. And they've really struggled to try to find a new economic footing in sort of the postmodern, post-industrial world that the West currently lives in. London, by contrast, does fine. It's a 10 million strong, not a megalopolis, but metropolis. There we go. That's the word I want. It's a 10 million strong metropolis with a very large tertiary sector, generates a lot of value, a lot of taxes, et cetera. It's very successful. So, it's not that you can't have a national economy that depends on the services sector. People who say you can't are wrong. Like, you can totally do that. But the trouble is that it's going to have a lot of inequality because, again, most of the industries that are going to drive a services sector-driven economy are not going to be ones that are really all that accessible to people who don't have college degrees, who are not well networked, who didn't go to the right schools, et cetera. You can see a lot of that in the tech sector, with the tech unicorns like Fang and whatnot. You can get into those if you're just like a regular dude who went to college. Well, I mean, I shouldn't say that. Networking isn't everything in terms of getting a job in Fang, in the top tech industries, but it can be important if you want to kind of rise up the ranks. But regardless, you still need a college degree to do that, so I shouldn't undersell that point. If you're just high school educated, like an economy dominated by those economic actors is not necessarily going to be one where you have as much opportunity as a manufacturing-driven economy like the one we used to have in the West. So that's like not necessarily the only, but one of the big problems that the British government has to face. Its economy is actually not terrible. It's not as bad as people make it out to be. The trouble is that it's not generating opportunities for everybody. Again, they've got some very competitive firms that lead in their respective niches. It's just not accessible to people who are just like regular Joes living in Manchester or Scotland, for example. These kinds of places need something more, and what that something more is not really known right now. Governments around the West have really struggled with this over time and don't really know how to deal with it. It's particularly problematic in the UK and even more so in the United States, because these societies prioritize individuality, self-sufficiency, and relatively small government. But if you don't have an economy that's generating opportunities for everybody, the intuitive solution is to tax the successful industries and redistribute that to the people who are struggling, and to either generate government jobs for those people or to generate government demand so that new industries can emerge that cater to those people. But in the United States and in the UK, there's a political resistance to that kind of redistribution. So that particular set of solutions is not really on the table. And so that creates a paradox. Like, how do you deal with the problem for which the main solution is not available? And the answer is that you end up with a kind of de facto redistribution. At least that's what we've seen thus far anyway in the United States. There is a kind of de facto redistribution of resources in the form of things like tariffs, in the form of industrial policy, and in terms of other sorts of policies that are not necessarily redistributive in nature, like an actual welfare system would be, but which have the de facto impact of redistributing resources to people who have been struggling. And in the United States' case, this redistribution happens in a way that allows those people to kind of pretense that they're being self-sufficient and individualistic while they're actually just as dependent on government as a lot of the people they criticize of being parasites. If everybody has to spend thousands of dollars more on goods because of tariffs so that you can have a job, that's redistribution. It's not fundamentally any different than having an actual enlarged, European-style welfare system. It's just one that privileges a much narrower slice of the population that, for whatever reason, has political attention, so to speak. The government, in this case, is largely empowered because of votes from people who feel disenfranchised, people who live in communities that have been deindustrialized. And so that represents a very special interest group. Unintended pun. That represents an interest group that the government is catering towards right now at the expense of much of the rest of the economy. And again, that is a form of redistribution. And hypothetically, that could assuage the political pressure, but that's also going to create economic waves that create countervailing political pressure that will probably result in that solution ultimately failing in the long run, which is going to put us right back where we started with the problem that we don't have a ready solution to. So the UK hasn't gotten to that point yet because the UK has more institutional barriers to that kind of populism. Again, Johnson kind of tried to do that, but for different reasons, largely of his own making, was unable to kind of move in the same direction that Trump has. It hypothetically could still happen, but regardless, like I said, I don't think that's actually going to solve the underlying issue because ultimately it will fail and you'll just be back where you started. So how do you solve this? Nobody really knows yet. There's no good solutions for the Anglo-Saxon societies. In particular, even societies that do implement large welfare systems still kind of struggle with this. Having large welfare itself doesn't necessarily solve the problem. It just sort of assuages and eases the problem. Anyway, that gets into a broader conversation about European welfare systems and their sustainability, and we can get into that if people want to. But in general, I'm just trying to describe here why Starmer is relatively unpopular right now. Partly, it's just because of culture war stuff, but also it's just because there is this structural unpopularity that governments in the UK have been suffering for a time that stems from structural economic issues that nobody really has a solution for yet. Does that make sense?
Yeah. He has a difficult job. So anyone in his position is going to struggle to have good ratings. But, yeah, more moderate than some of his predecessors in ways.
Yeah, definitely more center-left in the grand scheme of things. So is there another question?
Yeah, the other question was about some war plan leak that went in a group text. Is this a thing?
Did you see that?
I heard about it. That's the other question. I didn't see what it was.
Gotcha. Let me see. It was very stupid. Characteristically so for this administration. But still, yeah, it was pretty stupid. So, okay. So we still don't necessarily know all of the details about this. The early story was that the Secretary of Defense accidentally messaged detailed plans for airstrikes on Houthi targets in Yemen to the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic using an unsecure app. That's not really accurate given what came out later. And again, full details kind of pending, but what we've learned over time is that it was not the Secretary of Defense himself that added the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic. It seems that it was actually Mike Walls, whom is a national security advisor, whom was also in the group chat. He was the one who did that, it seems. The Secretary of Defense's culpability in this is just basically that he's the leader of the Department of Defense and nominally has oversight over national security matters, and so should technically be responsible for ensuring that communications like this are secure. In so much as he failed to do that, there have been calls for accountability on his part. But he's not the one who actually did the thing. Again, that was Mike Walls. As for what specifically happened, it was not actually war plans that were shared necessarily. It was actually more of a discussion between senior officials in the administration about airstrikes on Yemen. Now, eventually, there were details about the airstrikes shared, but most of it was just them kind of talking to each other about what they should do, critiquing the idea of bombing Yemen, et cetera, and then eventually settling on a plan. And it was only kind of after the decision was made that there was a detailed list of what the airstrikes would entail that was shared. Now, if that particular part had been shared, that could have been a problem. That would have been, well, I mean, it was shared, so it was a violation of national security, whatever the technical term for that would be. So that's the bigger problem. Discussing it beforehand, there wasn't necessarily any big reveals there. It was pretty much as everybody expected. So that's kind of the gist of it, basically. There wasn't anything too surprising. Again, J.D. Vance, the minion-in-chief of the Trump administration, was opposed to doing it, attacking, that is to say, launching the airstrikes on Yemen, because he thinks that Europe should pay the United States for doing that. That is to say, compensate the United States for the expense of securing the seaways from the threat posed by Houthis striking shipping running through the Red Sea. And that's a goofy opinion, because the United States doesn't do it for Europe. The United States does it mostly for itself. It benefits the United States to have a European economy that's relatively strong because they're our largest trading partner. But we make a lot of money off of them when they hurt economically. That hurts us economically. Also, the other big reason that the United States is active in the Red Sea is because of Israel. The operations conducted by the Houthis to disrupt shipping in the Red Sea, that's meant to directly and indirectly pressure Israel during its war in Gaza. So by trying to stop the Houthis from doing that, the United States is implicitly backing Israel and providing them diplomatic and military support. So the United States has a self-interest in doing it and also has an interest in defending Israel, in so much as that's a core national interest anyway. So it's not just about Europe. So trying to frame it that way is just goofy to me. That seems like some very narrow-minded realist, quote unquote, thinking. We've talked before about how realism is not especially realistic, depending on the school of thought and the individual thinker. So Vance very much seems to embody that in a lot of ways. But again, he's done that before, so no surprise, pretty much as expected. There was a back and forth, but the rest of it was pretty bland. You know, basically some people arguing that we should do it, and then listing some reasons, and then people posting emojis. You know, it was a very prototypical group chat in that sense. I would point out, just as an addendum here, of all the people that they could have accidentally added, the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic is particularly hilarious. Because The Atlantic, if you're not familiar with it, is a publication that is editorially dead set opposed to the Trump administration. It's not like they accidentally added somebody working for Fox News or something. You know, this would be like accidentally adding Rachel Maddow or something to your group chat. So, you know, pretty much inevitable that this was going to go public, given who they added. No surprises there.
How do you make that fumble?
Again, that's not clear. Like, it's a very stupid kind of mistake. You should be able to keep journalists out of a high-level group chat like that. Some of the other criticisms I've read have focused on just the fact that they were using a group chat at all. Because, you know, digital devices are kind of flawed, right? You know, you can implement encryption, you can do things, but overall, the best way to ensure that nobody eavesdrops on a high-level discussion about war plans of one kind or another is to just do it in person. Like, that's the safest way to do it. Beyond that, if you are going to use devices, you know, if you are going to use a group chat like this, the other criticism I read is that there are actual government applications that are specifically designed for this purpose that you can use and are relatively secure compared to commercial alternatives. And it seems they were using a commercial alternative instead of one of those approved applications. Again, the application they were using was called Signal. And that is actually used by journalists in order to hide their sources. Apparently it involves end-to-end encryption and whatnot. So the trouble is not that it wasn't encrypted. The trouble, again, is that it's not secure. The application may be secure, but your phone probably is not. You know, most people are really dumb about personal digital hygiene. And high-level government officials are not immune to that.
Yeah, that makes sense. If someone's appealing to the political sensibilities of America and has the ability to schmooze and network to climb the ladder and stuff, that's very different than internet security protocol.
Yeah. What was the other problem with Signal? Oh, yeah, there was another criticism that Signal deletes all of the messages after a period of time, so there's no record. And that's a problem because, legally speaking, as a government official, you're actually supposed to preserve records of your communications. And so using Signal is basically just tacitly, explicitly admitting that you're not adhering to that requirement. So some people were calling into an investigation of that as well. So it seems like this was done not because it was like a big priority, you know, not because they really needed to talk about airstrikes on Yemen as soon as possible. It seems like this was just the path of least resistance. You know, a lot of the guys in the administration don't have a lot of experience and probably are used to using group chats in their traditional commercial background. You know, again, Steve Witkoff, one of the guys in the group chat, is a real estate agent, or was before he became envoy in the U.S.-Russia peace negotiations. Pete Hegseth, you know, Secretary of Defense, did not have any kind of senior position in the military. before he became Secretary of Defense. He had spent most of the years before becoming SecDef as a pundit on Fox News. So, in those kinds of environments, a group chat like this would not be out of place. So it seems like they just kind of defaulted to it out of habit without considering standard operating procedure or the broader security implications of doing so. Again, given the inexperience of the people involved, that's not that surprising. Marco Rubio, I would have expected more from, but if everybody else is doing it, then what can you do? He probably got roped in. I have to say, out of all the people in the Trump administration, Rubio has done the best, I would say. It's still kind of early, but he's at least appeared professional and competent in his role of Secretary of State, much more so than a lot of the other senior folks that I've seen in the administration thus far. That's to his credit. I don't always agree with everything he does, but I give him credit for conducting himself in a way that says that he takes the job seriously. Unfortunately, that apparently didn't stop him from participating in the group chat, so he's kind of involved as well. But again, it's the Secretary of Defense's responsibility to kind of sort things like this out, so that's where most of the attention has been. So yeah, just goofy circus dumb shit. That's about all it is. Probably nothing will happen. There's already been a Senate hearing, I think? Some kind of congressional hearing where they had some of the people involved come before some representatives. And so they grilled them, of course, and basically they denied culpability, denied responsibility, etc. No surprises. And it seems like there's not going to be any significant traction on actually firing anybody or removing anybody. So no accountability. Nothing's going to happen. That should surprise nobody at this point. That is exactly what I would have expected. So no surprises.
Whoa, oh, whoa, whoa, oh, oh no, oh, what the fuck? Oh.
Well, people are gifting a lot of subscribes. Thank you, chat. Wow. Yeah, those are the two things that people ask me about. UK Prime Minister and group chat meme. I haven't kept up with other stuff super closely aside from those.
Oh, there's been a fair amount of clownery out of the administration. I mean, we could do nothing but talk about the Trump administration for the whole 3 hours, but I think it would be very boring for people. And most of it isn't necessarily high-level threat stuff. Most of it is just circus stuff, not necessarily overly threatening. Mm-hmm. So, instead we can just kind of go through the usual. We can go through trade policy, Ukraine, and then maybe China. I had a backlog of China stuff, so that could be worth doing. And if we have time, maybe we can slip in some Trump stuff at the end, depending on how people feel. So how does that sound to you?
Yeah, it works for me.
Okay. So many options. Let's take a look at... Oh yeah, Israel also. The world is a happening place in 2025, Neuro.
I believe it.
And not in a good way. Okay, so what's been going on with Ukraine for the past week? There was a Black Sea ceasefire deal agreed. Basically, the idea is to facilitate greater trade. They kind of were already doing that, so it's more of a lateral move overall. And again, this is going to be localized just to the Black Sea. It's not a broader ceasefire. It's just going to involve the respective navies of the combatants involved, not attacking each other's navies. So fairly limited, and again, they were kind of already doing that. They were striking each other, but the Russian Navy had already withdrawn from the western Black Sea because it was having trouble withstanding successive attacks by Ukrainian maritime drones of one kind or another. So there's been some sniping for the past year and change, but overall it's been a pretty quiet part of the overall war. So again, not really giving up anything by agreeing to this. It shows some good faith without substantively requiring anything of anybody. Exactly the kind of concession that the Trump administration seems to have a predilection for. So again, no surprises in this regard. However, the one caveat is that the Ukrainian government did say that any Russian ships appearing in the western half of the Black Sea would be considered a violation of the ceasefire. So it's not even that they're saying that if Russian ships sail into the western Black Sea and attack them, it'll be a violation. Their just being there at all is going to be interpreted as a violation, which kind of goes beyond just a mere ceasefire. So it'll be interesting to see if the Russian government agrees to that, either explicitly or implicitly. They could agree to it in principle and then just ignore it in practice. And then if they come under attack, they could blame the Ukrainians for violating the deal. That wouldn't surprise me. That's well within Moscow's playbook. But it's still early days yet. We'll see. But that was one development that came out of the peace talks, which are ongoing. The United States introduced a revised mineral agreement to Ukraine. Let me see. I didn't have time to completely organize these notes, so let me try to read through this. Let's see. Washington demanding Ukraine and the U.S. together establish a supervisory board to oversee a joint investment fund, which would distribute revenues from oil, gas, and mineral projects between the two nations. Let's see. The U.S., for its part, would appoint 3 of the board's 5 members, which would give Washington full veto power over the fund. And let's see, there was also, they said that the agreement could be signed as early as next week, which didn't happen. We'll get to that. It's not that different than the previous agreement. If you've heard me talk about the previous agreement, then you know that I think it's like 90% bullshit, because it's not actually a mineral agreement. It's actually just a reconstruction fund. It's just basically a vehicle through which money from energy projects can be reinvested into the Ukrainian economy, which doesn't really have much to do with, quote unquote, giving the United States control over Ukraine's minerals. So this is very similar to that. The difference lay in the supervisory board, because that had not really been discussed in the previous agreement. In fact, a lot of the details in the previous agreement were actually left to a hypothetical future agreement. So it seems some of those details it seems that Washington is trying to elaborate some of those details in the revised agreement. And one of those involves the United States very explicitly, basically I shouldn't say explicitly, implicitly controlling the supervisory board by having de facto veto power. Ukraine is not really gung-ho about that. Their officials came out and said that agreement was pretty unlikely and that they would haggle, basically. They've learned by now not to reject the Trump administration's proposals. That's the dumb way to do it. Instead, you say that you don't really agree, but you're willing to negotiate, and then you never agree. That's the way to handle this. That's how they didn't handle the previous agreement, and that, of course, blew up famously. Eventually, things evened out, but I'm sure Kiev would prefer to be a little more nuanced this time, and that seems to be what they're doing. So you're probably not going to see another big blow up like you did a couple weeks ago.
Gotcha.
Let's see some other details here. So in the new proposal, the fund would cover projects undertaken by the Ukrainian government itself, as well as those approved by Kiev or state-owned entities. That's also an elaboration in the previous agreement. It was only stipulated that projects covered by the Reconstruction Fund would be new projects involving basically energy or other sort of energy-adjacent industries. But as for, exactly whether projects started by the Ukrainian government or state-owned enterprises, that was left ambiguous. So it seems like in the revised agreement, they're using a broad definition here to encompass pretty much anything involving the government at all. So given that the state in Ukraine plays a very large role in the energy sector, that is basically all energy projects. Now, again, if this is basically just a modification of the previous agreement stipulated that existing projects would not be subject to the fund. Again, it would only be new projects started that would be encompassed by the fund. So if that continues to be the case here, then it's only going to be projects that the Ukrainian government or state-owned enterprises start in the future that will have to pay part of their profits into the fund, which will then be redistributed according to the detailed provisions of the agreement that have yet to be agreed. Let's see, the agreement under the revised agreement would also extend to infrastructure linked to natural resource extraction. So again, previous agreement focused on energy. Here in the revised agreement, the areas of Ukraine's economy that will be subject to the fund are expanded to include not just the energy production, but also infrastructure involved with distribution of that production. So things like roads, railways, pipelines, ports, and processing plants would be involved. That's not necessarily a deal breaker unto itself, especially if this is just referring to new construction, new projects. Certainly Ukraine would welcome investment from pretty much anybody, including the United States, and stuff like that. And let's see. So this is one of the other provisions, and this is one of the more controversial ones. Funds generated under the latest proposal would be converted directly into foreign currency and sent abroad. Now, that was not part of the original agreement. The original agreement is that all of the profits that were put into the fund would be reinvested into Ukraine. Now they're saying that all of it would be converted into foreign currency and sent presumably to the United States. That's not going to be acceptable to Kiev, which wants that money to help with its own economy and whatnot. Again, it's going to take billions and billions of dollars to reconstruct Ukraine's economy, if not its society generally. So having money siphoned off from new projects, kind of a non-starter from Kiev's point of view, unless they get something really good in return. And then Ukraine, this is another provision, Ukraine would be responsible for covering any compensation in case of delays or disputes. So basically putting all of the liability on Kiev in case there's some kind of disagreement that comes out of the implementation of this agreement. That's a lot of liability to place on one party in the agreement. I imagine that's another aspect of the agreement here that Kiev is going to reject. Or, well, maybe not outright reject, again, want to haggle about. Let's see, some other provisions, and these are more, again, controversial provisions. The United States would receive royalty payments from the fund from before Ukraine. That is to say, the U.S. would have priority, and there would be a 4% surcharge on late payments. The United States would retain priority rights over infrastructure projects and would retain a veto on selling resources to third parties. That's a lot of power for Washington to have over the production, sale, and distribution of resources in another country.
You can't sell shit to other people.
Well, you can, you just have to get approval to do so. And you also have to make sure the United States gets its cut on time or else. And then also the United States has de facto control over infrastructure projects, or at least priority control, quote unquote. So again, all of that would require Ukraine to cede, in effect, a lot of sovereignty to Washington. And again, given that energy is a key sector for Ukraine's government, that the government is deeply involved in, they're going to be very, very reluctant to give up all of the control they have over that, unless they get something very good, which Washington has not really been offering thus far. Now, Zelensky did respond to the new proposal by saying during a summit in Paris, apparently, that the U.S. was, quote, constantly changing the terms of the agreement, end quote. However, he added that he did not want Washington to think Kiev was opposed to the deal. Again, that's him learning from the previous experience. I think he did come out a little later and very explicitly reject the new agreement. So I'm not sure what the status on the mineral agreement is at this point. The Trump administration may well just drop it, because I don't think it's really in the public's sort of imagination right now like it was a couple weeks ago. So long as Ukraine doesn't make a big visible deal about rejecting the agreement, I suspect that either the Trump administration will drop it, or they will indulge Ukraine in renegotiating the agreement into a form that is more amenable to Ukraine's interests. That won't stop Washington from trying to frame whatever renegotiated revised agreement they come up with as being some kind of grand victory for the United States. The Trump administration is very big about declaring victory, almost regardless of context or circumstances. But the final agreement should be a lot different than what we've seen thus far in the revised agreement. Again, I just don't think Kiev would accept anything else. So the mineral agreement theater continues. I don't think it'll go anywhere, but that's where it is right now. Some of the latest items on Ukraine, Vladimir Putin came out and floated the idea of having Ukraine be governed by an official UN-appointed government. Kind of like what they do in Somalia, basically. The idea there is that Putin is implicitly arguing that Zelensky's government is illegitimate and that there needs to be a new government that is, according to Putin, competent, that can lead Ukraine and actually negotiate peace. As you can imagine, Ukraine is not going to accept this, and really it's just sort of a fig leaf for the Putin government trying to exact some kind of regime change in Ukraine so that a new government that is more amenable to Russian interests in the region can come to power. Oh, and I guess this last item is just a fun fact. Since the war started, as of now, let me rephrase that. As of now, more than half of newly sold vehicles in Russia are Chinese made. Before the war started in 2022, that was less than 10%. So basically, with all of the sanctions and whatnot, Chinese automakers have been able to eat up significant amounts of market share that had been held by Western car makers.
Huh, that makes sense.
Let's see, that's all I had on Ukraine. There really hasn't been a lot of new developments that I'm aware of otherwise. Lots of theater, the peace negotiations are ongoing, but other than that, no major new developments. I did think it was interesting that ceasefire has not fallen yet. I remember reading months ago that it was on the verge of falling, but it seems that it's been able to hold fast. So
who holds it now?
They're holding for now, yeah.
Ukraine holds it now?
Yeah, Ukraine still holds it.
Mm.
Yeah, it was one of those ostensible major linchpins in the front line that the Russians were hoping to take.
Mm.
Yeah, they've taken several over the past year and change. I think Avdiivka was one. Bakhmut really wasn't one, but media made a big deal about that. There was another one too, Prokhorovsk, is that what it was? I always get the name wrong. It starts with a P, and it's got a couple syllables. But no matter how many times I look at it, I always end up misremembering it. That was another one that the Russians were able to successfully take last year. I think ceasefire and Krematorsk were supposed to be the next ones, but I don't think they've actually fallen yet. Part of that, I think, is because the Russians have redirected some of their forces to Kursk, which the Ukrainians now are on the verge of being ejected from completely.
And that was an area of Russia that the Ukrainians advanced into?
Correct.
The Kursk offensive, I remember it.
Yeah, the Russians were able to kind of pinch them at the entry point. You know, the border between Ukraine and Russia is like super awkward in terms of strategy. You know, there's not like really great obvious choke points and whatnot. It's just sort of this weird winding extended border with lots of places where you can invade, you know, be it one way or the other. Mm-hmm. And so when the Ukrainians moved into Kursk, they didn't really have the option of moving on a broad basis. They basically just had to penetrate on a relatively narrow part of the border and then go as deep as they could. They could either go wide or they could go deep, and they chose to go deep. And so that worked for a while, but once the Russians were able to mobilize a response, they started pinching them at the border along that narrow base that they'd entered on. And eventually they were able to narrow that down so much that the Russians were able to put the supply line that connected the Ukrainian troops in Kursk with Ukraine under constant bombardment. You know, one of the things I've been reading the past few weeks has been reports from guys trying to run supplies into what was left of the Ukrainian position in Kursk, and they said that they were constantly under attack by Russian drones because they were just that close. You know, there was basically just one road connecting Ukrainian units in Kursk, you know, back to Ukraine, and that was very easy for the Russians to attack, and that's a big part of why the Ukrainians ended up losing Kursk. They just couldn't keep their guys supplied anymore.
Gotcha. Yeah, it seems really easy to harass trucks No. So even if you control an area, if you're trying to get trucks of stuff to those people who are there, you harass them with drones, you drop grenades on it, it's going to be tough.
Yeah. Well, trucks have always been vulnerable. That's not new, but when you've got a front line as squirrely as the one in Kursk, then they're especially vulnerable. Preferably, you want to keep the enemy as far from your supply lines as possible. But that just wasn't possible in the case of Kursk, given the nature of their operation. I have read that they're starting to push into Belgorod a little bit. That's new. I don't think it's going to be as big as the Kursk offensive, but the Ukrainians have been kind of feeling out Russian positions there a little bit. I don't know if that's something that they're doing just to kind of put the Russians off balance, maybe to tease a potential offensive in order to kind of redirect Russian forces from elsewhere, or if it's just local skirmishing that's being misinterpreted as some kind of prelude to a broader offensive. But if there is broader activity in Belgorod, there are early signs of it coming here. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Your guess is
I
good
think
as
I
mine.
pronounced
don't know
it.
these ones.
Sorry, what?
Your guess is as good as mine. I don't know these ones.
Yeah, I think it's next to Kursk. And I've previously mispronounced it Belgograde, and I think somebody in chat bitched me out because they thought I was talking about Belgrade, which is a completely different thing. So I think it is Belgorod, and if not, I apologize. My Russian is bad. Okay, so that's all we had for Ukraine. Trade policy. Trump administration never fails to entertain in terms of its trade policy. Actually got a fair amount today. Do you want to do this, or would you rather just talk regions?
Well, a lot of people have the question of like, what does all the tariff stuff mean? So I guess if there's anything clear about what's actually going through, not just what's being threatened, I think it's a.
There's no clarity.
Okay.
There's no clarity. Nobody knows what the fuck is happening. Maybe least of all the administration itself. You know, they announce one thing 1 week, and then the next week it's something else. So markets are perpetually off balance. I generally refer to markets in order to interpret what kind of economic impact a given policy announcement will have. And generally markets are able to kind of give a pretty decent reading on what that'll be. But in the case of the Trump administration's tariff policy, markets have no idea what to make of it because they've received so many mixed signals from the president and his administration. Even in terms of individual talks, things have been confusing because Trump actually called up, I shouldn't say called up, he met with a number of CEOs of major automakers, and they had a conversation about the tariffs, and Trump was utterly intransigent. You know, they kept telling him this was going to squeeze their profits, this was going to raise prices, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And Trump himself just wasn't having it. You know, he said that they were going to make the country prosperous, they were going to make the automakers more money, and he also threatened them, which I found entertaining. He said that if they raised prices in response to tariffs, then he would punish them. Which is kind of ironic, given that he's supposed to be a laissez-faire free market president, right? Not exactly what I would expect from a Republican, but such is the times we live in. So no clarity. We have details, we have some information, but trying to make sense of it is a yeoman's effort. But we can get into it. Let's see. I had a number of stuff here. Sorry, a lot of different stuff here, of different categories, basically relevant to trade, but not always dealing with specifics of the administration's tariff policy. So we're going to kind of meander a bit, basically.
Sure. Can meander.
So one of the things that the Trump administration did when it announced that it was going to do reciprocal tariffs is that it sort of invited countries to negotiate over them. And that basically happened when the Prime Minister of India visited Trump a couple weeks ago. And they actually had a talk about trade policy. And one of the things they agreed to do was to try to negotiate a new free trade deal between the United States and India. Now, if they could pull that off, it would be a big deal, because there's been a lot of talk about the United States and India potentially being strategic allies, but there's not actually a lot of meat to the existing strategic relationship. That has to do with a variety of factors, not least of which is that deeply ingrained in India's security institutions is a extensive, if not extreme, paranoia of dependency on what they perceive to be strong, hostile foreign powers. And yes, the United States does qualify. They've always been very wary of Washington in the national security apparatus in India, as well as the foreign policy apparatus in India. So penetrating that such that you could agree to a free trade agreement, that would be a major signal of progress and trust between New Delhi and Washington. So this is a big endeavor if they can actually do it. I'm deeply skeptical, but I give them credit for trying. Now, one of the things that the Trump administration highlights as a major barrier to improving Indian-American relations is reciprocal tariffs. Again, the Trump administration wants tariffs to be equal between countries, and they've complained bitterly when they see that tariffs on a given good are higher in a partner country than the corresponding tariff in the United States. India has a lot of those. Now, that's not because India is, quote unquote, taking advantage of the United States, like the administration would say. A lot of that is just because historically the United States has recognized India as a developing country. And as a developing country, India has qualified for special treatment. Traditional US policy towards developing countries has been to allow them to have tariffs that are not reciprocal with the United States in order to help them develop economically. This was not really a big ask for the United States, because again, these are not really industrialized countries for the most part. India more so than, say, Zimbabwe. But in general, they're not really industrial competitors to the United States, such that the lack of reciprocal tariffs has been a big problem for US producers, with some exceptions. But for the most part, that's been the case. And that's why Washington has allowed India, in particular, to continue to have a reciprocal, shall we say, tariffs. The Trump administration either doesn't know that or doesn't give a shit about it, and they've been applying pressure correspondingly. So that led me to kind of look into the auto market in India in order to try to understand a little more why whether or not US car producers are present in the Indian market, and if they're not, why not? As it happens, they're not. Now, the Trump administration would tell you that the fact that the United States has a trade deficit with India is indicative of exploitation by India of the United States. That's their traditional framing of trade surpluses. And one of the things they highlight is that high tariff in India against against cars in general, including American cars. So, is it the case that high Indian tariffs have stopped US automakers from entering and competing in the Indian market? It is a factor, but keep in mind that India as a large market has leverage, and like any large market with leverage, they have pushed foreign producers to produce relatively more of the stuff that they sell in the country that they sell it in. So India is no exception. There have been examples of American car producers trying to enter the market and setting up localized production to do it. However, the problem that they have had has not really been tariffs in that regard. Again, producing locally means that tariffs haven't really been a problem. The bigger problem is just bad business management on the part of the American firms operating there. There are two issues that they had, and these were the two issues that were at least listed in the article I read about it. One is tax structure in India, which they were not really ready for. Maybe they weren't aware of it, but I've got to think that they were. The other issue is that they gambled on income growth translating into demand for larger cars, and that failed miserably. So to get into this in a little more detail, the tax structure in India is such that larger cars are taxed more. So what I had here in my notes is that cars less than 4 meters in length and with an engine of up to 1.2 liters attract a duty of 29%. That is to say, a 29% tax. This is in India, by the way. This is not a tariff. This is just a general tax that they apply to these particular types of vehicles. Taxes on larger vehicles, that is to say, again, longer than 4 meters, engine capacity higher than 1.2 liters, they can actually go even higher, up to 50%. So 29% to 50% tax on large vehicles. I probably should have explained this earlier. Why am I talking about large vehicles in particular? When American firms entered India, their whole strategy basically was just to sell large American cars. If you're not aware, American car companies basically specialize in producing larger cars because that's the preference in US markets. And they kind of assumed that they would be able to do the same in India. Part of the reason for that assumption I'll get to in a minute. But that assumption and that business model clashed with the local tax regime in India. Again, the larger cars are the ones that are taxed more, if not the most. And so that put that put American car makers operating in India at a disadvantage, given that they went with a business model that was so dependent on large cars. Okay, so the gambling thing. So again, I have to think they knew about the tax issue. So I think this is probably the bigger explanation for why American car producers ended up struggling in India. They really believed, given that a lot of them entered the market around the time when India was reforming its economy, this would have been like late 80s, early 90s, they believed that growing income growth in India would translate to more demand for the bigger cars that they were trying to sell. That was an implicit assumption. The trouble is that over the course of the next couple of decades after liberalization in the early 90s, it just didn't happen. There was income growth. There was a lot of economic growth in India, and there was a nascent, large, growing middle class that could have afforded larger cars. They just didn't want them. They were not popular in the market. And the result is that a lot of these car makers, again, American car makers, just failed miserably. Hypothetically, they could have adapted to local preferences and tried selling other types of cars, but it seems they never bothered. It seems they really just went into India hoping to sell existing models that they had sold in America, and when it didn't work, they just kind of gave up. And the result is that American automakers have largely left India's market. At this point, well, let me add some detail to this. It's not the case that no foreign car makers can succeed in India. The fact that American automakers failed says more about their management than about general business difficulty in India. And it can be very difficult to do business in India. That's a whole topic of conversation unto itself. But other foreign competitors have entered the market and successfully thrived there. Japan is the main case in point. Japanese car makers actually dominate India's car market. They don't necessarily dominate in terms of selling their own Japanese models, but what they did is they entered the market, set up local partnerships with Indian car makers, and then basically sold rebranded versions of Japanese cars of one kind or another. And this business model was very, very successful. If you look at if you define Japanese market share in India's car market in terms of not only Japanese car makers, but in terms of Japanese car makers operating partnerships with local producers, that sort of broader definition encompasses about 80-some% of the car market's market share in India. It's dominant. It's very large. Suzuki in particular has a local partnership, which has something like 30 to 40% of market share in India. It's just massive. So it can be done. Japanese car producers have done this. They've entered the market and adhered to the rules and catered to local preferences such that they have been successful. American car makers, even with the tariffs as high as they were, could have done the same thing.
What's the difference in an Indian automobile experience? Like, why would they not go for American cars? And what does Japan have to do to make their cars sellable to the Indian market?
So for one, obviously the tax issue I mentioned. Larger cars are taxed more, so smaller cars are relatively cheaper. More to the point, larger cars eat up more fuel. They're less fuel efficient. Drivers in India prefer cheaper rather than more expensive because they don't have a lot of money. Just because you're middle class in India and can afford a larger car doesn't mean you're not on a budget. Yeah. So in general, the preference is to save money on fuel efficiency rather than having a bigger, flashier car that maybe costs a little more to fuel. I think those are the main issues. More fuel efficiency, and then also, I think traffic is worse in India. That might be a factor too. I didn't read that, but I do know that's true. Traffic in India is very bad, so having a smaller car could be an advantage in that regard. Also, Indians don't really have a lot of garages. Even if you're middle class, you don't necessarily have a lot of space to work with, because India is a famously crowded country. So having a smaller vehicle means easier to store, more space efficient.
Gotcha.
Yeah, the article didn't go into the details as to why Indian preferences were necessarily that different, so I'm not as familiar with that. But some of the structural factors in the market, those were the things that the article more focused on. Oh, and I had some car market stats for India as well. The average new car in India costs $10,000, which is about 1/4 of the average car price in the United States. The average used car price in India is $4,000. And for scooters, it's about $1,000 to $1,500. Also, another fun fact, in India, there are only about 120 odd million households with an income between $7,700 and $15,400. And that is basically the market for cars in India. Everybody else just doesn't really have the money. They're using bicycles, scooters, public transportation, etc. So it's 1.4 some billion population in India, but out of that, only about 120 million are really a viable market for the kinds of cars. Well, for cars in general, the automotive market, shall we say.
I guess, why don't we just sell them smaller cars?
That's what the U.S. car makers should have done, but they didn't. And then when their approach failed, they just didn't adapt. They literally just picked up and left the market. It wasn't worth it to them. So that's, again, not a problem with tariffs. That's a problem with U.S. automakers being bad at business. And, given how much American manufacturers have been financialized over time, Boeing in particular being a case study in that at this point, maybe it's not a surprise that they, rather than competing, just kind of gave up and went with the path of least resistance, which is to go back to the US and just double down on big cars. So all of that is to say that a free trade agreement between the US and India, while it would be significant, is probably not going to lead to a change in terms of the access US automakers enjoy to the Indian auto market. And even if it did, it probably wouldn't lead to greater market share because they're bad at the game. To use gamer terminology, you can have as much access to India's market as you want, but you're still just bad at the game. And you're not going to be able to win unless you adapt to local conditions, which for some reason US automakers have refused to do. Okay, next item. So there's been some talk about China. We might have talked about this before. I apologize if so. So there's been some talk about the Sino-American trading relationship, whatnot. The Trump administration is pressuring them. Chinese government is trying to strategize about it. So I've heard some talk that China may actually accept. This is, again, purely speculative, but there has been talk that the Chinese government may be interested in a kind of quid pro quo, akin to what the Japanese agreed to in the 1980s. And so the idea here is export quotas. These are voluntary quotas that are imposed not on the part of the importing nation, but on the part of the exporting nation. So what happened in the 80s, without getting into that in too much detail, is that Japan agreed to restrict the quantity, specifically of Japanese cars that were exported to the United States. And that was done as a quid pro quo with the Reagan administration to deal with trade tension between the US and Japan. It was actually part of an overarching deal involving currencies and whatnot, but that's, again, a whole conversation unto itself. But basically, that was the gist of it. So there's talk that China might be interested in doing something similar. The reason that this was popular in the 80s, or at least that both parties were willing to accept it anyway, is that it still allows the exporter to make money by exporting stuff to the importing nation, but it creates some protection for indigenous industries in the importing nation. because the quantity of exports is restricted on the part of the exporter, supply in the importing country is limited, and that actually drives up the price. Now, driving up the price means that the exporter is able to make roughly the same amount of money. Obviously, the math on that will shift, but roughly speaking, if you sell less but at a higher price, you can still make the same amount of revenue. So that was a nice trade-off on the part of that was perceived as a nice trade-off on the part of the Japanese automakers, and then the American automakers enjoyed the fact that prices were higher because that meant that they could be more competitive. So hypothetically, China could agree to something similar with regard to a whole litany of goods that it manufactures and exports to the United States. In exchange, there could be the Chinese could extract de-escalation in the trading relationship, and maybe also allow relatively more. Well, the hypothetical deal could involve Chinese FDI in the United States. If you don't know what FDI is, that's foreign direct investment. Basically, the idea here is that the Chinese government would greenlight more investments by Chinese firms into the United States, such that they would be helping the U.S. economy, which presumably the Trump administration would be interested in. There has been talk that the Trump administration would be willing to accept more Chinese FDI. Obviously, they're not going to allow it in certain strategic sectors of the economy that they don't want the Chinese government sort of meddling with or to have access to. But there are broad swaths of the economy that are not critical in that matter that the Chinese could invest in a way that would not be seen as threatening by Washington. So that is on the table, but it's unclear if it'll actually go anywhere. That's the big question right now. But that is a potential direction things could go, and it does suggest that both parties are interested in creative solutions. They are trying to think about the problem. And yes, that had been an open question, whether or not they were actually thinking about the problem. The Trump administration is famously performative in a lot of its antics. And so there was a question about whether or not they were actually interested in a deal with China, or if they were just pretensing, basically mugging for the cameras. So if this is true, that suggests that there could be an underlying deal in the works. We shall see. Let's see, we had a bunch of stuff on cars. Yeah, this is some more stuff on automotive markets. Specifically, this has to do with CUSMA, the NAFTA replacement deal. So Canada, the United States, Mexico. There's been a lot of talk about tariffs and what impact that they'll have if they are actually implemented. For some reason, the Trump administration in particular is focused on cars as a target of tariffs. They're going to do broad-based tariffs once the reciprocal tariff regime is implemented starting in early April. In a couple of days, presumably, you're going to hear about that a lot in the next week. But cars in particular have been noted by the administration very specifically. So this is a big topic of conversation. So what impact will tariffs have on the automotive market in the United States? Well, the impact, from what I've been reading recently, is going to disproportionately fall on the lower end of the market. So, there are, of course, different varieties of cars. I'm not a car guy, so I'm not the guy to ask, but that is my understanding. There's a whole litany of different categories and whatnot. And one of those categories is basically low cost, for people who want cheap cars. And that particular category is the one that's going to be damaged the most. If you're a luxury car maker, you can kind of absorb the cost from tariffs. If you're a luxury car maker, you're selling to people who are probably of means. They probably have decent access to money and aren't necessarily going to mind paying a few thousand more in order to get their preferred vehicle. But if you're poorer, you're a lot more price sensitive. So even a relatively small change in price is going to be a big deal to you. And you're the one that's going to be getting screwed the most, apparently. The reason for that is because, one, American automakers basically just gave up on the low-cost market. Even though they had the option of shifting production to Mexico and Canada, U.S. automakers just haven't really been interested. The best rate of return is on larger vehicles that are mid to high priced. So that's what they focused on. In turn, the low end of the market has largely been dominated by foreign producers, especially Asian producers like Japanese and Korean automakers. And their production is not actually located mostly in Japan or South Korea. It's actually located mostly in North America. they wanted to take advantage of proximity to the final market, basically. However, even though they produce in North America, for the most part, they don't produce those cars in the United States because it's too expensive. If you want to make a low-cost car, it's basically impossible, even mathematically, to make it inside the United States. So you pretty much have to make it in Canada and or Mexico. And that's what they've been doing. But that means that if the tariff regime is implemented, as the Trump administration has been discussing, then that part of the market is going to get hammered. I've seen people talk about thousands of dollars in increase in price for a lot of the low-end car brands. And I've even seen some speculate that it might be more cost efficient for automakers just to withdraw from that market entirely. In other words, rather than charging higher for cars that are supposed to be for a low-income demographic, they may just stop producing them entirely because they don't think the business model works with the tariffs at all. In which case, you're going to see a huge shift in demand from new, relatively cheap cars over to used cars. And that's going to be a problem too, because that demand is going to be sufficiently large to push up the prices of used cars as well. So there's no escaping it. No matter where you go, you're going to face higher prices for cars. Again, higher income brackets, not necessarily a problem. Lower income brackets, about to get hit pretty hard, most likely, if the government actually goes through with this. As an aside here, I want to talk a little bit about economics, because economists will tell you that this is all very bad, and it is. They're right about that. But as some inside baseball that some of you may be interested in, economists in general don't really look too much at specific markets. If you look at trade research, that is to say, economics research on international trade and whatnot, it generally looks at aggregate macro data. It doesn't always, unless the researcher wants to get really niche, look at how individual industries are going to respond to changes in international trade. So the result is that economists, when they talk about how tariffs are bad and international trade is good, they're speaking very generically. That's kind of a big picture viewpoint based off of big picture data. However, it's important to keep in mind that if you do get granular, if you actually do look at individual industries and markets, and especially if you start including the effects of laws and other things like contracts that are kind of more, how should I say, non-quantitative, unquantifiable. Once you start including and accounting for things like that, then you can get some outcomes that are not necessarily in keeping with economists' predictions. So yes, in general, the overall economy will suffer if you disrupt international trade, but there could be individual industries that do succeed and thrive, depending on their particular circumstances. Again, it just depends. So it's entirely possible here for the tariff regime to be implemented and for the waves it generates to not necessarily be that noticeable to most people. Again, as I've just discussed, it is going to hurt some people, but it's not going to hurt everybody equally. It's going to be distributed. There's going to be, in other words, a lot of variance in terms of impact. And that variance is going to be fodder for politicians. Because invariably, whenever anything deviates from the generic, broad, big picture predictions made by economists, politicians love to jump on that and try to use it to suggest that economists don't know what they're talking about, that they're wrong, etc. That's not really the right way to interpret economics research. Again, economists are not trying to dictate public policy. They're trying to provide guidelines and rough predictions to understand how things are going to unfold in the future. In other words, a degree of forecasting. But as any economist will tell you, forecasting has its limits, and economic methodology has its limits. We're trying to give you a rough idea of what's going to happen, not a detailed crystal ball prediction of what exactly is going to happen. So try to keep that in mind when you start seeing political leaders of one kind or another, of any political affiliation, digging on economics research, individual economists, etc. It's not our fault that the economy is fucked. We didn't do that, all right? We're trying to help you. In so much as economics theory can be a little fuzzy and a little too generic, that's just because getting more granular means that you don't generate conclusions that are useful to public policymakers. We can get more granular, but there's not as much demand for that kind of research. There is some generally in private industry, but they're not asking for public research. They generally hire their own researchers to do that kind of work. And that's generally not made public. They prefer to keep that to themselves for business strategy reasons, basically.
Makes sense.
Let's see, we talked about the threats. Let's see. Oh, yeah, so this was another detail. This has to do with oil. So apparently there were a number of representatives of the oil industry in the United States that met with administration officials, making the argument that if tariffs were implemented specifically against Canada, then energy prices would inevitably rise. And so there are some people in the administration who have commented that as a result of those discussions, that tariffs on energy imports would be relatively mild, or maybe not at all. This is an actual concern because a lot of US refineries are designed to handle light Canadian crude oil. And they're actually just physically incapable of processing the sort of heavy oil that is produced by American oil fracking firms out west. You know, they can frack as much oil as they want, but without the refineries to actually refine it into useful stuff, most of that is just going to have to be exported. You can build new refineries to handle the fracked stuff, but that's going to take a long time and be very expensive. And as we've discussed before on here, investors are not really super gung-ho about investing in the oil industry these days. They don't really see it as a good bet. So there's not a lot of new refineries in the pipeline, and as a result, the United States is kind of locked into importing Canadian crude for most of its oil needs, especially in the northern United States. In the southern United States, it's actually more Venezuelan crude. So let's see some more details about the reciprocal tariffs that are coming in. The administration announced that cars again. So the 25% tariffs that they're going to implement, this is a little different than a reciprocal tariff. This has to do with the 25% tariffs that the Trump administration put on cars during the whole kerfuffle with Canada and Mexico before they were delayed for a month. So these are going to come back into effect with the reciprocal tariff regime. So similar, but not exactly the same thing as reciprocal tariffs. The 25% tariffs on car imports are going to apply to all car imports, and they're going to extend to car parts, but not until early May. So starting in early April, there's going to be a 25% tariff on all car imports, and then a month later, there's going to be a 25% tariff extended to cover imports of any and all car parts. Okay, next item. Okay, this isn't really a trade policy thing, but this is relevant. So you've heard of Hyundai, right? It's a Korean, I think, car maker. So that's what happened is that Hyundai announced a $5.8 billion steel plant. They're going to build it in Louisiana, and it's part of a broader $20 billion that they're going to invest in the United States. Now, the Trump administration latched onto this and said that it was an example of how their tariff policy is working. So I looked into that because I was curious. I'm kind of on the lookout, basically, for evidence one way or the other of the impact the tariffs have been having on the private sector. So I latched onto this, looked into it, and it's possible that Hyundai could be investing in the United States because it's concerned about tariffs. But I think it's unlikely. And the reason is that Hyundai, over the past couple of years, has actually already been investing in the United States, and specifically in steel. So the idea that they would be investing further in steel production here is actually in keeping with that pattern. You could argue that they've been investing in the United States even before Trump won the election because they were concerned about potential future tariffs from a potential return to power of Trump. That's feasible. However, keep in mind that the steel plants they've been investing in are being constructed in order to provide steel for the production of electric vehicles. And I don't really think that's something that they would necessarily care too much about tariffs. Because again, if you're going to sell a car in the United States, it helps to just build it in North America anyway. That's actually just more cost efficient generally for most cars, unless they're really expensive high-end cars. I guess EVs could be considered high-end, but again, there's so much EV infrastructure in terms of private sector capacity in North America. It makes sense economically to produce it here. So investing in the United States to help with EV production, that is in keeping with just market priorities. That doesn't necessarily require or is influenced by tariffs. I think you could make an argument that it is. Again, I don't want to reject that completely out of hand. But given that this seems to be part of a long-running plan that goes back several years, it may have been planned even further back than that, I'm a little hesitant to give the administration credit for this one. I think we talked a couple months ago about one of the things that the Trump administration would do in terms of trade. And this is referencing stuff that I learned from the first term. From the first term, I inferred that the Trump administration on trade will do two things. One, it'll take credit for plans that never end up happening, because private sector firms, it doesn't cost private sector firms anything to announce an investment and then later not follow up on it. There were a number of cases like that in the first term. There's probably been some already this term. The second thing that they're going to do is take credit for stuff that was going to happen anyway. And I think the Hyundai steel plant might be such an example.
That's pretty funny.
Let's see. Sorry, what?
That's pretty funny. People attribute all kinds of stuff to the president anyway, so it's a effective gambit.
Oh yeah, that's one of the big sort of myths, that the president controls the economy or plays a big role in the economy. About the only way a president can really direct the economy is by fucking it up grievously. And most presidents are cautious enough to avoid that. So there are policies they can implement that help, that hinder, but in general, the private sector drives most economic activity in the United States. Presidents have historically been given way too much credit. Let's see, more threats. Always more threats. Trump said that if the EU works with Canada to, quote, do economic harm to the United States, then he will implement even higher tariffs.
We're going to send you tariffs, and if you mess with our tariffs, we're going to give you even more tariffs. And if you start working with other people, because we tariffed you, then we'll tariff you again. Okay.
That is exactly what he is saying.
That's like someone who's already doomed to die from some terminal illness and someone's threatening to kill them, and they're like, I'm already going to die. You can't scare me with that. I'm already getting tariffed here.
Yeah, one of the ways that America's trade partners could respond to the Trump administration's tariff threats is by presenting a united front against the United States. So if they did coordinate with each other so that any pain implemented by the United States is shared and in which any response is unified, that could bring to bear a lot of pressure on the United States, much more than could be done just with bilateral negotiations. This is actually an argument the United States has made with regard to China. The United States argues that the way to deal with China's economic influence is to present a united front in the face of Chinese economic pressure in order to kind of, how should I say, offset the advantage China would normally enjoy in bilateral negotiations, since China has so much more influence economically bilaterally with individual nations than it does with all of them as a whole. So this is kind of the flip side of that. And the United States government, of course, recognizes that and is trying to scare other countries into not doing it.
I see.
Random statistic, half of car sales in the United States are from imported cars. Let's see, Hungary. So how would Central and Eastern Europe be impacted by tariffs? Exposure is relatively limited from what I read. However, growth could be hit sort of vicariously by way of Germany. The German car industry is actually a major employer in Eastern Europe. There's a lot of integration between German car makers in Germany and suppliers of car parts located in Eastern Europe. As you can imagine, cost of living and costs of production are lower in Eastern Europe than in Germany. So there's been a lot of car companies in Germany that have outsourced to Eastern Europe in order to take advantage of it. So Eastern Europe does not necessarily do a lot of direct trade with the United States, but they do a lot of indirect trade with the United States by way of German car exports, which could be hit significantly, depending on how the tariffs are implemented. And let's see, more car stuff. I only have this twice. How weird. Okay. Let's see, threats. Oh, yeah, that's some random data. Let's see, lawsuits. So when CUSMA, and again, this is the agreement that replaced NAFTA. CUSMA is the easiest way to say it. There's actually different pronunciations. Every signatory of the deal basically put their country first in the name of it. So in Mexico, it's not called CUSMA or USMACA like it is in the United States. It starts with M. It's Metsa, something like that. CUSMA is the one that's the easiest to pronounce, so I'm defaulting to that. So as part of the CUSMA negotiations back in Trump's first term, one of the sticking points in the negotiation was what would happen hypothetically in the future if the Trump administration decided to start applying tariffs on them again. So in order to deal with that, the United States actually, as part of the agreement, agreed to allow, in the case of renewed American tariffs on Canada, Mexico, or even just general tariffs on everybody, instead of having those tariffs apply to Canada and Mexico, they would instead have an alternative regime that they would default to, which would be basically a quota regime. This is similar to what I was talking about before with regard to Japan and China. Basically, there would be a quota, a set number of individual goods that could be exported according to the old tariff. And then once the quota was reached, once they had exported an amount equal to that quota amount, then the new tariff would be implemented. So they would still be hit, but they wouldn't be hit as bad as other producers that did not in other countries that did not have this agreement in place. Now, the question is, given that this agreement is nominally legally binding, can the Trump administration legally hike tariffs against Mexico and Canada to 25% and get away with it? That's not entirely clear. In general, the administration is running fast and loose with its tariff authority. This may surprise some people, but the power of the tariff, that is to say, the power to set tariffs, is not a power that is held by the executive branch of the United States. That is actually a power exclusively reserved by the US Constitution for Congress. You may then wonder how the President of the United States can set tariffs so wildly as he has been. And the answer is that over the years, Congress has written laws that give some discretionary power to the sitting president to change tariffs if certain preconditions are met. And the Trump administration has been interpreting those preconditions very loosely and broadly, such that they effectively have seized control of the tariff regime. Now, Congress could challenge that and stop it very easily. That is well within their constitutional power. They're just choosing not to, because Congress right now is controlled by the Republican Party, which is not really of a mind to challenge Trump right now, because, to put it bluntly, they're afraid of him. There's people in the GOP that do not like what the government is doing, but don't really feel like they can challenge them. So, what does that mean here? So what that means is that Trump may well just ignore this agreement outright, but then that opens the door to potential litigation by Canada and Mexico. They may argue that the United States government is violating a treaty obligation, which is technically legally binding. So this could well go to the courts. What would happen there? Not entirely sure, because some of the legislation that the Trump administration is using to set tariffs does stipulate that the United States can hike tariffs if it is being discriminated against, or if trade treaties are being violated, or a couple other provisions. And the administration may argue that it has the power to do this according to those provisions. I don't think those provisions were intended for the present circumstance where you just have an administration that wants higher tariffs and is unilaterally imposing them without Congress. But that doesn't mean that they won't win. So we'll see. But that is to say that this tariff kerfuffle, whatever you want to call it, that the Trump administration is indulging in, the legal side of it is very shaky. This is not something that it actually just has undisputed power to do. So it's possible that trade partners could successfully sue the administration and force courts to force the administration to drop the tariffs or otherwise change them. It's also possible that within the span of just 2 years, Democrats could take back control of the House and just take back all of control of the tariff regime and change all of this very readily. And in 4 years' time, you could have a completely different president that just does a complete heel turn and reverses all of this. I would point out this very fact is one of the reasons why it's unlikely that a lot of firms are going to actually invest in American manufacturing, because that's a years-long investment that may or may not pay off, and it could very easily blow up in your face if all of these tariffs just go away in a few years.
Yeah, it adds a lot of volatility and unpredictability.
Let's see, Canada. So what is Canada doing about the tariff threats, some of the new things it's considering? Well, I guess I shouldn't say considering. This is something the new prime minister has talked about, but I don't know what tangible action has been taken. But what he said is that firms that relocate car manufacturing or car part manufacturing away from Canada should not be allowed to sell cars in Canada. Now, I thought that was an interesting idea because it raises an interesting cost-benefit analysis. If you are an American automaker, which do you choose? Do you choose to continue to keep production in Canada, but then pay basically higher taxes on the goods you sell in the form of tariffs? Or is it more cost efficient to relocate the factories to avoid the tariffs, but then lose the Canadian market? So I tried to look into this, and it's kind of hard to get all of the details, and I'm sure as just like a regular guy, I'm not going to be able to solve this. But what I found is that about 20% of all US car exports go to Canada. So that's a non-trivial percentage. That's a pretty good chunk of US exports. So you're going to miss that if you are an exporting automaker here in the United States. However, it's also the case that the tariffs are going to be accumulative. That is to say, car parts that are used as part of the manufacture of cars in the United States, they cross the border multiple times. So what that means is that each time they cross the border, they get tariffed again. So the accumulated impact of tariffs is not just going to be a one-off 25% tariff on cars or car parts. If you accumulate the total impact, it's actually going to be something closer to 75%. That is to say, there's going to be a 75% tax on cars once you take into account all of the different taxes that are applied to all of the different individual cases of car parts crossing the border.
Ouch.
Which is a lot higher than 25% and is probably, I would guess, enough to encourage a lot of automakers to relocate. However, losing Canada is a big deal, and again, relocating incurs risk that could punish you if all of the tariff stuff goes away in a few years. But otherwise, if you ignore that, it would seem like this would work in the Trump administration's favor. Circa 75% roughly accumulative tax on car production outside the United States. That probably is worth a Canada's worth of car sales if you're a US car maker. Now, it's worth pointing out, like I mentioned before, there's going to be a lot of variance here. Not every car maker in the United States depends on Canada to the same degree. So those that are more dependent on Canada in terms of supplies, they're facing probably more pressure to relocate. On the other hand, those companies that sell relatively more cars to Canada, they're probably more likely to want to preserve production in Canada. And of course, there's probably any different combination of the above. You know, if you're a car maker that doesn't really source a lot of parts from Canada, sells a lot of cars to Canada, easy decision. But what happens if you do both? then it gets more dicey. Then you're really going to have to dig into the data to figure out what is the most profitable option. Do not envy automaker CEOs. They're facing some tough decisions right now.
And these changes are in effect now, or they could go into effect, so people are trying to prepare?
People are trying to prepare. They haven't happened yet. The car tariffs in particular were supposed to be implemented a couple weeks ago, but the administration announced they would be delayed so that they would be implemented at the same time the broader global regime of reciprocal tariffs was implemented.
At the same time as the TikTok ban, right?
Different.
I'm being facetious. Because TikTok came back and it's not really banned in the sense that it seemed like it was.
I see. Yeah, no, they probably will implement these. It's probably not going to be a kayfabe bullshit thing like the TikTok issue was. Yeah, the reciprocal tariffs and the car tariffs should be implemented in the next couple days, I want to say.
Who's supposed to benefit from these? The U.S. government just gets more money?
Well, there will be more tariff revenue. That much will happen. Beyond that, who's supposed to benefit? I mean, who's supposed to benefit is Americans. There's supposed to be more jobs that result from this because more companies relocate more manufacturing into the United States to get around the tariffs. Even if that happened, though, it would not result in a net increase in jobs because there would be retaliatory tariffs that would cost us export markets, which would lead to people getting fired. So in the end, it's at best a lateral move. But that's, of course, not how the government is going to frame it. So who wins from this? The economists' view, mathematically speaking, is fucking nobody. This is just objectively going to make everybody worse off if you break down the numbers. In terms of the politics, the people who are supposed to, quote unquote, benefit are the broader American public. Who actually benefits? Maybe Trump politically. You know, if in so much as this is something his voters wanted, maybe they'll reward him if he does it. I've seen interviews with people who voted for Trump, with the interviewer asking them what they think about the prospect of inflation stemming from tariffs and the overall disruption that's been caused by the Trump administration's trade policy. And the general reaction seems to be passivity. They seem to be willing to put up with it because they think it might make the country stronger, wealthier somehow. So he's not really incurring much of a cost thus far. And if he actually does go through with it, he could argue, you know, promises made, promises kept. And his voters may like that more than the pain that it causes. Let's see, some hedging. So China, Japan, South Korea, they all export a lot of stuff to the United States. All of them are very wary of the Trump administration's trade policy. And so they have gotten together and held an quote unquote economic dialogue. And it's the first time they've done it in 5 years. And that 5 years is a very telling number because that was roughly the last time when the Trump administration was in power, the first term. So they did, I remember during the first Trump term, talk to each other about strengthening economic ties. They didn't do so in a notable way. They weren't like flaunting it, but it was pretty clear that it was kind of aimed at the Trump administration. They were basically signaling that they had options if the Trump administration decided to pressure their trading relationships with the US. So they did that in the first term. They're doing it again now. And they haven't really agreed to do much. You know, they certainly didn't agree on anything tangible in the short term, but they did agree in principle on a couple things. One, they want to facilitate regional trade. Obviously, that's an offset to the potential disruption of exports to the US. Also, they agreed to, quote, closely cooperate for a comprehensive and high-level talks, end quote, specifically on the negotiation of a South Korea, Japan, China free trade agreement deal. So there's not really a free trade agreement deal in place right now between China, Japan, South Korea. They do have something called RCEP, but that was not a very ambitious an agreement, and that encompassed sort of the region as a whole. It wasn't something specific to this trilateral relationship. So an actual free trade deal that focuses on those particular three countries could actually open up a lot of trade and integrate their economies much more tightly. That would be to the detriment of America's interest in the region, since that reduces our leverage, but that may not be a bad thing to the current sitting government, because the current government doesn't really want to be involved in foreign affairs. So I'm not entirely sure where the line is drawn between the Trump administration's desire for isolationism and its desire to look strong. Those are two competing priorities. So on the one hand, if this free trade deal were signed, the US has less leverage in the region, which makes us look weak, which is bad, according to the Trump administration. But it also means that relations in the region are better, which means it's less likely the United States needs to intervene militarily, which presumably would be good if you're an isolationist. So I'm not entirely sure how the administration is going to react to this, if it reacts to it at all. Their attention span is pretty short these days. But I expect it to be prototypically schizophrenic and unpredictable, whatever it is. We shall see. But it is a smart move on the part of Tokyo, Beijing, and Seoul. You do want to make sure that you have options in case things with the US go sideways. So a smart move on their part. Also a smart move not to agree to anything in the short term. Hypothetically, they could have agreed to more trade agreements of one kind or another that opened up their markets to each other. But I think the fact that they didn't indicates that Tokyo, Seoul, and Beijing are interested more in signaling right now that this is something they could do in the future, not something they're necessarily inevitably going to do for sure. Basically a stalking horse, if you want to put it like that.
And a stalking horse is what?
Well, basically when you're negotiating with somebody, it can improve your negotiating position if you make the counterparty think that you have another offer from somebody else in the cards that you could agree to as an alternative to them.
Right. Yeah, that's something I saw people do when buying cars from a car dealership is like you go in there, you look at stuff, you see what you like, they tell you about it, they try to sell it to you, and then you're like, okay, this is good, but I'm going to go check the other ones that I'm interested in. And when you do that, that puts pressure on them to try to retain you as a customer, so they'll sometimes change the deal if you say, well, I have this other attractive prospect as well. Makes sense.
Okay, so with reciprocal tariffs in the cards, some countries are going to be more impacted than others. One of them is Ireland. Why Ireland? Ireland exports a lot of pharmaceutical goods to the United States. And given that it's a relatively small economy, any disruption to one of their leading export categories is going to be a big problem for them. So the Irish government is actually kind of rallying the troops and trying to get everybody on board with some kind of unified government. I don't think they have anything in particular negotiated yet, but the government is basically warning people that they could be in trouble depending on how the tariffs are actually implemented. I'll point out that while the Trump administration has said that the tariffs will be general, global, and reciprocal, they have highlighted a few particular industries that they're interested in. One of them, like I said before, is cars, but another one is pharmaceuticals. So Ireland is going to be very much in the crosshairs here. What they do about that or what they're able to do about it, I'm not sure. Keep in mind, Ireland is a part of the European Union, and the European Union does go to bat for all of its members, regardless of their trading relationship with the United States. Again, the whole idea behind the EU is to create a united front that makes the whole stronger than the individual parts. So it's possible that the European Union and the United States, in their negotiations over tariffs, could kind of wrap Ireland into that. I'm sure the EU will definitely want to do that. So it's not the case that Ireland is alone. The United States isn't going to be able to just push them around because it's a small country. The EU will treat an attack on Ireland as an attack de facto on the entire Union. So that'll be a part of whatever negotiations come out of the broader EU-US tariff negotiations. But that said, Ireland, they do have a problem here. They are going to need EU help, for sure. Let's see. Oh, some more economic stuff. So one of the unintended consequences of the steel tariffs that the Trump administration has already implemented is that by restricting access to the U.S. market, they are in effect deflecting production elsewhere. So let me put this in a different way. Within the domestic U.S. market, the effect of steel tariffs are going to be higher prices. for steel. But the effect outside the United States in the global market is going to be lower prices on steel because producers don't have as much demand coming out of the United States. The US is just consuming more of its own steel. So the result then is lower prices, and that actually presents a problem if you're a high-cost producer like the European Union. It costs relatively more to produce steel in the EU, but they try to subsidize it so they can maintain it. But whenever global prices fall, that always makes them less competitive and increases the cost of subsidizing those steel industries. And so with the recent fall in the price stemming, well, the expected fall in steel prices that are going to come out of the US tariffs, the EU is planning to implement further protections for its steel industry in order to deflect all of the to deflect all of the supply of steel that is going to be redirected away from the United States towards the rest of the global market. So when a major market implements tariffs, it creates global issues in the economy that affect everybody else. It's not just one individual country that is affected. It has a reverberating effect.
Makes sense, though.
Okay, that's all I had for the trade update.
Cool. We have
Hopefully
gotten
that's
some
of
questions,
use.
I think.
Sorry, what?
We have gotten
questions.
some questions.
Okay. During the post-war consensus, post-World War II, the UK had lots of public spending on social welfare programs. What changed? Just low taxes due to Thatcherism. I mean, the UK still spends a lot on welfare programs. It doesn't spend as much as it used to, and that actually is because of Thatcher. But certainly if you compare the UK to, say, the United States, like, you guys spend a lot more than we do. Especially on, I think, a per capita basis. So I don't know that anything necessarily changed. It is still mostly a welfare state. It is a country that embraces that particular style of politics and welfare provision. The issue more recently that stems out of restrictions to the welfare system is austerity, and the austerity just stems from a sluggish economy. You know, the population of the UK is growing, partly because of immigration. And as the economy grows, the burden on the welfare system grows in turn. So in order to pay for that, you need a growing economy, and the UK doesn't have that. So something has to give, right? You can't have a stagnating economy and a growing welfare state. It's going to be one or the other. And in order to kind of bring the welfare state in line with the financial means of the government has had to make cuts over time. Now, you can argue at times that the cuts were deeper than they needed to be. I think that was one of the big criticisms of the Cameron administration, if I'm remembering it right. He was the conservative leader that took power after Brown. You know, chat can keep me honest on his name. I may not be remembering it correctly, but he was the Tory in power after Brown, and he was known for implementing a regime of austerity in order to try to reduce the fiscal deficit. He's also known for failing pretty miserably at doing that for a variety of reasons, but it was not a successful effort. But they did make big cuts, and that was a part and parcel of trying to bring the nation's finances, bring the nation's expenditures in line with the nation's finances. And there's just no avoiding that. That's not necessarily anybody's fault. You know, that's just the British economy struggling. And, you know, we already talked about just why it was struggling. So, you know, I refer back to that, basically. But one of the knock-on effects of a struggling economy is that you can't expand expenditures on growing entitlements. You know, either the entitlements have to shrink, or you have to find some way to raise revenue from other areas. Mathematically speaking, it's just impossible to do otherwise. You can put it off. You can delay it by borrowing money. In effect, that's what the UK has been doing the past couple decades. But, you know, as the Tories have pointed out repeatedly, that's not a sustainable approach to the problem. You know, sooner or later, you're going to run out of money to borrow, or other people with money to lend are going to stop lending it to you because they don't think you can pay it back. So they need to bring it into line, or they need to reduce the economies to generate the growth they need to pay for an expanded welfare state. a series of, I guess I'm just listing trade-offs at this point, but basically those are the trade-offs the government is having to face, and that's why the welfare state has been shrinking in the UK over time. It's not something I would ascribe just to Thatcher. She definitely did oversee cuts to social welfare programs, don't get me wrong. That was definitely a thing that happened. But that's not the reason for the more recent cuts. That just has to do with, again, the economy and the nation's finances. Let's see, what's the latest news from the Department of Commerce on chips? So for those of you who don't know what chips is, that was a piece of legislation passed over the course of the Biden administration that was designed to be an industrial policy that prioritized the production of advanced semiconductor chips inside the United States. And the Trump administration doesn't like it. They have said that they want to scrap it. And Trump himself has made statements to the effect that it would be better to use tariffs to incentivize semiconductor firms to manufacture inside the United States rather than the CHIPS Act approach, which is to subsidize production of chips in the United States to make it more competitive. That's not entirely a bad argument. It is much cheaper to use tariffs rather than to just give government money to big corporations that produce semiconductors. The issue is whether or not it's going to work, which I don't know that it will. Highly debatable. But I haven't heard any updates recently on how they're going to operationalize that in practice. Because the law was passed by Congress, so technically the administration is legally obligated to implement it. As we've seen with the whole Doge drama, that obligation has not stopped the administration from refraining from fulfilling that obligation in other such areas. So the CHIPS Act may be a similar case study, but we'll see. The CHIPS Act actually does disproportionately benefit conservative constituents because a lot of the manufacturing, a lot of the incentives in the bill were designed to try to locate manufacturing in areas of the country that have been struggling. So those have generally been conservative places in the Midwest, the deindustrialized Midwest, and in some cases the South. Those places have seen most of the new construction projects designed to result in new chips production capacity here in the United States. So that could lead the Trump administration to averring, that is to say delaying, its cessation of the CHIPS Act, in so much as that's even legally possible. But I have no other news beyond that. I haven't heard anything specific. The administration seems to have its focus elsewhere for the moment. Any updates on Mahmoud Khalil and the Turkish student who was disappeared? I don't think she was disappeared. I think they know where she is. But yeah, I don't have any updates that you yourself don't already know. The administration tried to deport them. The courts put a hold on it, and they're currently deliberating on whether or not any of this is even remotely legal. I don't think there's been a final judgment yet, so I don't have anything new in that regard. I don't even know if the press has access to those court cases, because I think there's a different standard for those, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know. Now's a good time for the usual disclaimer. I'm definitely not an expert on everything I talk about on here. More painfully obvious at some times than others. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I do inevitably read it later, and we do enjoy all of the feedback.
Thank you, chat. And YouTube comments.
How would the U.S. take Greenland? Is joke, but also serious, sort of? I know what you mean. I know the feeling. Like, he is joking, right? Right? How would the U.S. take Greenland? For one, I don't think it will. I think the whole thing is just more dumb theater for domestic political consumption in the United States.
You would have to buy it, though. What would the justification be for a military invasion of a huge icy landscape that's not very habitable?
Why do you need a justification? Why not just do it? It's not like there's much to stop you. The entire population of Greenland is only like 60,000 people. It's nothing. And it's not like Denmark has a whole bunch of military assets there. NATO as a whole really doesn't have a lot of capacity to project power beyond Europe. So unless France and the UK want to try something, then there's not much they can do to challenge.
Why take it?
Why take? There's no good reason to take it, honestly. In terms of the justification, there's no good justification. I mean, the Trump administration has tried to argue, often hilariously, that Greenland is absolutely necessary for the national security of the United States. The wording Trump uses when he makes these arguments is just utterly toddler-like. You know, it's, we need to have it for the freedom of the free world. He's actually said these things. It's crazy. So yes, you could make a national security argument, but the problem with that argument is that Denmark is perfectly happy to allow the United States as much access to Greenland as it wants. During the Cold War, for example, the United States had around 24 military bases in Greenland. And Denmark was fine with that. It was not an issue. In so much as the United States doesn't have as many military assets in Greenland now, since the Cold War ended, that's because the United States itself has downsized its presence there. A fact that, I mind you, contradicts the administration's argument that it's not necessary for the national security of the United States to control Greenland. If that were the case, why hadn't previous administrations, or even the previous Trump administration, increased the military footprint in Greenland? Surely, if there was a threat to Greenland, or a threat that necessitated the use of Greenland, the United States would have escalated its military presence there at some point in the past 10 years. It hasn't. And the reason it hasn't is because there's no such threat. And the fact that there's no such threat just illustrates why the whole thing is just bullshit. So, clear-cut example there of why this is just nonsense. More evidence to that effect. So the national security argument is bunk. There's an economic argument that there's a lot of resources in Greenland, in particular critical minerals, that the United States absolutely needs to secure its future. And that's bullshit too. And we talked about this last time. Like, you don't need Greenland in order to gain access to rare earth materials. We have them here. They actually exist everywhere. They're not rare at all. They're just hard to find in any particular concentration. You have to mine the shit out of just virtually anything, basically, in order to get them, extract them from the ground. And then you have to pollute the shit out of the environment in order to do all of the pooling necessary to sort it all out. It's a whole mess.
These rare earth salesmen and saleswomen are doing a great job at making people think that they really need this stuff. We are not going to survive as a nation without this rare earth. And it's like the rare earth salesman says, yes, yes, your empire will crumble if you don't get our rare earths.
Yeah, somebody in the industry may well have the presidents here, and that would at least make some sense. But we have them here. We could totally just refine them in the United States if we really, really wanted to. The fact that we haven't is just more evidence that the whole thing is just not that serious. It hasn't really been a big priority. So I don't think Greenland would be any different, because if Greenland were part of the United States, it would be a part of the same regulatory regime that's held up progress on the refining of rare earths in the United States. So you're literally just importing Greenland and then having the same problem you already had. It doesn't solve anything. So that's ridiculous, right? The rare earths thing is bunk. Critical minerals go beyond just rare earths. You could argue that there's maybe lithium or cobalt or whatever the fuck in Greenland. There's some truth to that. But even there, like, it's bullshit. Because mining companies could have at any time in the past couple decades started mining in Greenland, any of that stuff, right? They know where some of it is. The reason they haven't is because it's fucking expensive. Hypothetically, either the European Union or the United States could have subsidized them. That would have made sense if it was a big strategic priority, but they chose not to. Because it's not a priority, because it's not that big of a problem. You can get those resources from other countries that are friendly to the West. You have secure supplies already in place. You don't need Greenland to do that. So even the critical minerals argument beyond just rare earths is bunk. So beyond the economic reasoning and the national security reasoning, there's nothing. I haven't heard any other substantive reason for the United States to own Greenland. The only reason that I've ever wanted Greenland is because I thought it would be cool. That's literally the only justification I could ever come up with for why the United States should or would annex Greenland, because it would just expand our footprint in North America. Beyond that, there's just no underlying strategic impetus.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of potential for making really good heavy metal there because it's dark so much of the year that many people who live in these far northern countries make very good yelling music. So that's possible that they'll be able to harvest some of that. Maybe have some bands pop up there. There'll be American bands, but they would be in a different area of the world. Could make us more competitive in the metal album rankings for the next couple of years, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know what else you're getting from Greenland.
Yeah.
It looks big on the map.
Maybe I should revise the statement, there's no underlying strategic impetus. It does have a strategic location. It does make some sense for the United States to take it seriously. But the issue is that the United States has a more than positive relationship with Denmark. And so there's nothing the United States needs out of Greenland that it can't already get. Actually owning it would be just a lateral move in that sense. Now, to get back to the question, how would the US take Greenland? Purchasing is one option, although that would be, I don't know, there's something about that that feels very anachronistic. That's like something you read in a history book about events in the 19th century. It's not really something I've seen happen in, from the mid-late 20th century on. Has there been any territory that's changed hands by way of money in the past 70 years? I don't know that I can think of any. It would be a very weird approach. And of course, there's always military conquest. Again, the United States doesn't necessarily need an actual justification. It could hypothetically just do it.
That would be a dramatic change in table limits to directly attack an ally.
Well, it certainly would, but at this point, I don't think it would necessarily surprise people. Shock people, yes. Surprise, given the administration, not so much. Still, I don't think it's a serious threat. I don't think the administration actually takes Greenland that seriously. It's worth pointing out here that the Danish government itself has already said that it's not interested in giving up the territory to the United States, so it's not going to give it up voluntarily. That's pretty much been removed as an option by Copenhagen. It's also worth pointing out that the people of Greenland themselves are not interested in being part of the United States. I can't really blame them at this point. They had an election recently, and I think their center-right party won the election, but they chose to form a kind of unity government, specifically because they feel threatened by Washington. And they wanted to make sure that Washington knew that everybody in Greenland, all across the political spectrum, is unified in their opposition to being part of the United States. So a pretty clear signal there coming out of Greenland as to their preference. I think polling has shown that most people in Greenland prefer independence rather than being part of any particular country, either Denmark or the United States. So if they are going to have a change, it's going to be that. Although I've also read that Greenland receives a lot of money from the Danish government to pay for their welfare system, and that money is well beyond what they would be able to afford if they were just an independent country and not receiving those transfers. And that same polling shows that people are much less interested in independence if that independence does not come with a continuation of those transfers from Denmark.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it may be that even in Greenland, they ultimately vote against independence if they think it's going to significantly impact their existing status quo. I'm not sure how Denmark is handling that particular aspect of the problem. Let's see. A recent podcast explained Trump as merely a symptom of the growth of power of the executive branch at the cost of the legislative branch's power over the last 80-something years. There's a lot of truth to that. How might we avoid this trend continuing to its logical conclusion, something like the reign of Caligula? We're already in Caligula territory. You already missed the boat on that one, I'm afraid. Yeah, how do we fix this? I mean, it's easy to fix, right? It just requires Congress to do its job. Like, Congress has the authority to rein in the executive branch when it overreaches its authority. In fact, technically, Congress, according to the US Constitution, is the strongest branch. They've got the most authority if they want to wield it. The issue right now is that they don't want to wield it. And that's not a problem you can solve by law, right? The issue of the, what do you call it? imperial presidency, which is what you're talking about, yeah, that is a long-running problem. But generally, Congress has been willing to continue to exercise its authority, even in the face of the imperial presidency. Congress's behavior over the course of Trump's first term and during this term has been something else apart. That's a new development where Congress isn't even willing to use its own authority in the face of overwhelming executive authority. And there's no solution to that. That's a problem with voters. Voters have to vote in people who want to protect Congress's institutional authority and want to make sure that the executive respects constitutional limits on power. If voters don't vote in people to do that, then you don't get it. I've said before on here many times, and this here is a very clear-cut manifestation of this, it does not matter how well designed your democracy is, institutionally, in terms of rules, in terms of norms. If people want to break it, if people want to violate the norms and ignore the laws, then there's nothing you can do to save it. You need to have people who want to make the system work first. That is the number one prerequisite to a successful liberal democracy. And in so much as we're struggling right now, it's because we increasingly do not have that, which is a much bigger topic of conversation and is a much more threatening issue for anybody and everybody living in the US right now. Again, whole other topic, we can get to that if people want. But that's the issue here. That's the issue with Congress and the imperial presidency. Fixing this requires different voting, and we don't have that right now. It's just down to public preference. Maybe you could say this solution is education. Maybe if you educate people more on how liberal democracies fail and succeed, the institutional restrictions on power, the need to exercise forbearance when you have power, you can do all of that, and that might move the needle. But I think everybody knows how Americans are when it comes to education. We talk a big game, but then we discount it. Go to college. Why did you go to college? You should have gone into the trades. Why did you go into trades? That was a dumb thing. There's no consensus on what good education is in the United States right now. And even among people who do want to prioritize education, there's no consensus on how to define that. So it's an utter clusterfuck. And that doesn't even get into all the communities in the United States that don't really inherently culturally value education. And I don't say that as a dig against minorities. There's lots of white people in the United States who are exactly the same way. So until you solve some of those problems, those underlying cultural problems, political preferences, until you can find a solution to that stuff, Caligula time. And will continue to be Caligula time for the foreseeable future. I think the administration was talking recently about a third term, about there being ways to make it happen. Yeah, we're in for a rough ride here.
That's pretty different.
Thoughts on the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act and what the Trump administration is doing now? Smoot-Hawley was a lot more damaging. For one, it was implemented during a major recession. Right now, the economy is doing decent. I know a lot of people don't feel like it's doing decent, but it actually is just in terms of the macro data. So the big advantage Trump has is that it's doing better right now. So he has kind of a strong economy to work with. Smoot-Hawley was implemented, for those who don't know, during the Great Depression, back during the 1930s. So basically, the United States did something economically damaging at a time when it was especially vulnerable to damaging legislation like that. It went about as well as you would expect. Smoot-Hawley is generally used in economics as an example of how tit-for-tat escalation can result in tariffs utterly annihilating all of the benefits from international trade and impoverishing millions of people. It was a very bad thing. It's generally held up as what not to do in terms of economic policy. Damn. I don't think the Trump administration is there yet, because Smoot-Hawley was very ambitious, very broad, went into effect almost immediately. And the Trump administration, whatever else you can say about them, has been kind of dragging its feet on its whole tariff agenda. It's not entirely clear if they're doing it because they're just using it as a negotiating tactic, or alternatively, if they're just kind of buying time so that they can implement something more ambitious, because they don't want to completely shock the international economy by going full tariff in a very short time frame. could go either way at this point. We'll see. But I think that's one of the big differences there. You know, the Trump administration still kind of values trade to a degree. The actual degree is debatable, but they haven't abandoned it completely. The Smoot-Hawley tariff, by contrast, was just a very clear-cut rejection of international trade. Actually, this reminds me of an argument I made back during Trump's first term, which is that he's not actually waging trade wars. A trade war is more like what happened with Smoot-Hawley back in the day. The purpose of an old-school trade war is that you want to protect your markets to generate more jobs for your people and more demand for your industries. And you very explicitly reject imports in order to make that happen. The Trump administration has not thoroughly broken its trading relationships. Even in the cases where it's raised trade barriers, it's still negotiated. For example, in the Trump's first term, it put a lot of pressure on China, but the administration's ultimate goal was not to end all trade with China, although there were people in the administration that wanted to do that. What they wanted was a deal. They wanted to make some kind of trade-off with China, in which they got some of what they wanted and the U.S. got some of what it wanted. So that's not what you do if you want to wage like a full-scale, old-school trade war. You know, you don't need to negotiate anybody to start a trade war. You can just do it. And that's what happened in the 30s. Trump's not there, at least not yet. Let's see, with voting in mind, Trump has already signed an executive order and plans to sign more in relation to voting laws. How possible is it that he could make fundamental changes to voting laws that would disenfranchise voters? I think it would actually be hard to do, because as much power as the executive has in the United States, the Constitution actually very explicitly reserves a number of powers for states. And one of those powers is how people vote, specifically deciding who gets to vote. There are some things that states can't do. You know, they can't discriminate. You know, they can't say this minority group can't vote, etc. But in general, the actual process by which people are registered to vote and how the electoral system works in individual states, that is at the broad discretion of the state governments. The federal government, by contrast, doesn't have a whole lot of leverage to bring to bear there. I'm sure the Trump administration will try to find leverage, but in general, there is a long, what's the word I want? Not case study. Precedent, there we go. There is a long legal precedent in the United States, long-standing legal precedent in the United States, in which cases involving administrations trying to leverage, say, grant money that is given to states, trying to withhold that grant money in exchange for the states doing this, that, or the other thing that the administration wants them to do. That's been to the courts before, and the courts almost invariably ruled in favor of states. The government cannot take money that is supposed to be distributed to states, withhold that money, and then condition the end of the withhold, condition the money basically on the states doing something. That is illegal, very explicitly. So that's not something that the administration can do legally. They may try to do it. They may try to do it illegally. Whether or not the administration tries to do something like that has been something Trump critics have been watching since 2016. He hasn't done it yet, but everybody is afraid he will, given his whole demeanor and style of politics. But hypothetically, that's how it could happen. But yeah, I don't think it's likely. I think it would be an uphill battle even for an administration as sort of craven and belligerent as Trump. The legal pathways and actual mechanisms are not as available to them as with some of the other stuff that they've been doing, like, say, tariffs.
Gotcha.
What would Brian Boitano do if he were here right now? Who is that? A figure skater. I must be missing the reference. I have no idea. What would he do if he were here now?
He'd probably skate pretty well.
I'm inclined to agree.
It snowed outside yesterday, but the lakes and ponds are going to need a little bit more time to freeze. He'd probably fall through the ice into the water. Even if you're a good skater, you can't beat physics, so you have to be careful. Stay safe,
You
chap.
guys get ice? What is this
In
ice you
South
speak of?
Dakota? Yeah. South
We don't
Dakota
get
has
ice down here in
crazy.
Texas much.
Oh yeah. You have to have indoor hockey.
That is an actual thing. We have quite a bit of indoor hockey here in Dallas, actually. We have a successful professional hockey team that's made it very popular with the kids.
Chad asks, do you believe political views define a person? Ooh, that depends on the person because it's how invested
Yeah.
they are in it.
Yeah,
Some
that's a
people
good
are apolitical. They aren't invested in either party or any of the parties where they live. They don't engage with the political system. Politics doesn't really define them much at all. They do affect politics by their choices inadvertently, but it's definitely not a defining attribute. Some people, might never shut up about politics. So for them, it's much more of a defining characteristic, and whatever team that they go to bat for is going to also define a lot of their preferences and so on. But the parties usually represent broader sentiments that the people in the area hold, rather than the party made them up on their own. Because they want to catch votes. They want to serve the needs of groups of people, so people need to say what their needs are and what their preferences and traditions and all these other things are, so that you can have people represent them politically speaking. But yeah, you could assign a score from 1 to 10 of how politically invested a person is. I'm pretty low investment. This segment is an investment in that direction where we have conversations with you and stuff, but it's not really a hobby of mine to stay abreast of political news. It's hard to find good stuff, and a lot of the good stuff involves reading rather than watching, which is a more difficult attention challenge with all the other stuff going on. Chad, how politically invested would you say you are from 1 to 10? I'm probably like I don't know. I have to be above a 5 because we host a show on Sundays. Maybe a 6. I have opinions about stuff. I do vote, but I'm not really trying to change people's minds hardcore.
I'll add a caveat. We don't necessarily talk about politics so much as we talk about policy on here. Because we do focus generally more on the details of what is actually happening. We try not to editorialize. We try to inform. That is the purpose. More successful at some times than others, perhaps, but nominally that is more the gist of what we try to do here.
I do appreciate it when we get, I wouldn't say accused, but if we get told that we have a slant on something, that's always refreshing to hear, because they're saying that the vantage point is not neutral. We try to be neutral on most things as we can and be fair and let you decide things for yourselves, but we're humans too, and we have our limited perspective, and also every human has emotional reactions to things or reasons why they're for or against a certain topic. Yeah. Thanks for hanging out. There's probably a little bit of a selection bias, and the people who are hanging out through the segment are more likely to have political or policy inclinations of some kind.
How are we doing on time?
About 20 minutes, 20, 30 minutes.
Gotcha. Well, I did have a correction. Somebody was asking last time about Jair Bolsonaro, former president of Brazil. So my correction is that he is not actually on trial yet. I thought that he was. I said as much. But he's not on trial yet. But there is a court considering whether to bring up charges. Now, there is actually a different court in a different case that barred him from running for office until 2030. And that was the result of him saying that the 2022 elections were rigged. So those were two separate cases. I thought they were both the same case, basically, so I was incorrect. Let's see. There's so much just clownish stuff I could get to, but I'll put it off. The cryptocurrency stuff alone makes me cringe. Did you see the announcement, I think a week or two ago, where the administration was saying that they were considering using gold from the National Gold Reserve to buy cryptocurrency for the National Crypto Reserve?
Oh no. That would piss off the olds, I would think. They would be super against it. Because
it depends.
The olds
a
love
lot of
gold.
the olds voted for him.
Huh.
You know, if you made a skit or a parody where the president did something like that, people 10 years ago would have said it was hacky. There's no way that could happen. Welcome to 2020s.
Electrolytes are what plants crave. What can I say?
That fucking movie put a curse on us. Well, let's see. Did you see the big ass earthquake?
I heard about it. Thailand, right?
Burma, actually.
Oh, Burma.
Pretty much right smack in the middle of Burma, too. Almost the geographic center of the country. You know what the scale was?
Was it 7.7?
7.7, right on the money.
Nice.
Yeah, that's a big one. And you know, the Richter scale is actually exponential, which I didn't know until maybe like 5 years ago. So, you know, the higher end of the scale is like really high. It's not like hurricanes where it's linear. You know, 7.7 is exponentially more powerful than, say, like a 5.0 or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that fucker hit hard when it hit. Did an immense amount of damage. I'd say the videos coming out of Thailand are probably going to define it more. Just because there's more cameras and stuff in Thailand, it's a little more prosperous. Burma obviously is in the middle of a civil war. So there's not as much footage coming out of that particular country, even though it was ground zero. But it's been very destructive. I think it's a couple thousand dead now, thus far.
Ouch.
I've actually got some video I can send you. So you can kind of take a look at the highlights, so to speak, at your leisure.
Okay.
See, I had some other stuff on Burma. You know, people were asking about it, I think a week ago, and I didn't have much for them. So I did take note of a couple articles I came across in the past week where they did kind of crop up. There you are. Yeah, there were there was a tower under construction in Bangkok that collapsed because of the earthquake. So there's a bunch of video of that. And then there was a bunch of video of pools. Apparently it's fashionable now to put pools on the top of tall buildings.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a bunch of people that have footage of them in pools on top of these big towers in Bangkok. And you can see the water sloshing around because of the earthquake was so powerful.
Damn.
Let's see. Okay, so Burma. So one of the things I read recently is that rebels last October not only were able to successfully take this town that was the center of telemarketing scams. That's a whole story unto itself. But when they did that, they actually took a bunch of territory that was very prominent in the production of rare earths materials, which were generally exported to China for the most part, for refining and then export on to the rest of the world, if not consumption in China itself. So the seizure of these resources has actually put something of a strain on the rare earths refining industry in China. Not necessarily a big one, but prices have ticked up and they have impacted certain goods produced in China that use rare earths, use inputs that use themselves rare earth materials. So things like solar panels coming out of China, for example, have actually become more expensive over the past couple of months because the price of rare earths materials have risen in China on account of the rebels seizing this territory. Now, it's important to point out that just the rebels seizing the territory doesn't mean that nothing is happening. In fact, it would be entirely possible for the rebels to allow production to continue. They would make a lot of money if they did. But the reason they're disallowing exports to China is because they're seeking leverage against Beijing. Beijing has more or less been backing the junta, that is to say, the government of Burma. And they've been pushing for the past 6-some months for some kind of peace negotiation. And in so much as they have leverage over rebel groups, they've been using it to try to nudge them towards a peaceful resolution to the conflict. The rebels, for their part, don't want a peaceful resolution of the conflict that involves the government staying in power. They want to overthrow it. And so in order to deflect some of the pressure they're getting from Beijing, this one particular rebel group has cut off China from some of its rare earths and is conditioning the continuation of sales to China on a more amenable attitude towards the rebel groups in Burma. So the statistic I came across is that this particular region the rebels captured produces about roughly half of the world's heavy rare earths. Don't ask me what a heavy rare earth is. I'm not familiar enough with the periodic table to know that. I'll pitch that question to chat. I'm sure some smart people there know what that is. But this region produces basically a lot of that. And so it's significant in terms of its ability to sway markets. So it's not like Beijing can just shrug this one off. They do have to pay attention here. Whether or not they're going to be willing to play ball, not entirely clear. That remains to be seen. But it is an open question right now that the Chinese government is facing. So in other words, the rebels are making a play here diplomatically. We'll see if it pans out. Oh, and specifically, the specific rebel group that's doing this is the Kachin Independence Army, which is a long-running group that's been operating in northern Burma for like 50, 70 years, whatever it is. Those of you not familiar with Burma may not be aware of this, but there's a number of ethnic minorities in the hill country of Burma that have basically been fighting for their independence from Burma pretty much from the day Burma became independent from the British in the 1940s. So there's lots of conflict in Burma over the past half century plus. And some of these rebel groups are very experienced, very entrenched in their territory and have been operating for a long, long time. Not new. So the KIA, the Kachin Independence Army, it's one of those groups, one of the older ones. They're not like some new rebel group that just cropped up out of nowhere. They've actually been governing their territory up there for the better part of half a century now. Let's see. That's pretty much the gist of it. I could get into some of the other stuff. Some of the statistics here. Chinese imports of rare earth oxides and compounds from Myanmar dropped to 311 metric tons in February, which is down 89% year on year. Again, significant drop. Let's see. And most of that fall happened after October when the rebels seized the region in question. Spot prices of terbium oxide, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, the supply of which is concentrated in the relevant territory, jumped 21.9% between late September and March 24th. And then the prices for dysprosium oxide, whatever that is, which is also largely mined in Kachin, actually fell a little bit, 3.2%. Kind of runs against the narrative, but apparently it has not been in as much demand over the past 6 months, hence the milder impact on the market price. Let's see, that is to say Burma. Burma's heavy rare earths trade still generated about $1.4 billion in value in 2023. I shouldn't say still, it did. Yeah, Myanmar basically exported about $1.4 billion worth of heavy rare earths in 2023. So for a relatively small economy, that's actually pretty good business. Significant change. The rebels could really use it, but for now they're trying to hold it hostage so they can get more favorable diplomatic policy out of Beijing. Let's see. And then, also the rebel groups have actually been implementing a tax on the rare earth producers operating in their territory. Also keep in mind, most of the producers in that territory are actually just Chinese companies operating there. So that tax is meant to just obviously generate revenue for the rebels, but also to further discourage trade with China. Another form of pressure. Also, speaking of stalking horses, the rebels have a stalking horse of their own here in this negotiation in the form of India. The Indian government has actually sent some teams out to inspect the rare earth sites where they're doing all of the mining. I guess pooling, it's a weird process. Basically the rare earths mines, let's call it that. And supposedly India is interested in potentially sending its own companies out to mine them in the place of the Chinese companies doing it now. That's not really a credible threat right now, because even if Indian companies were interested, they don't really have the experience, the capacity, and also there's virtually nobody to sell to in India itself. There's almost all of the world's rare earths refining capacity is actually located in China. So India could mine them, but then it might find it difficult to sell them, since Chinese refineries would invariably be the only people available to buy them. And if Beijing wanted to, it could actually ban those companies from importing the Indian mined rare earths, which would make the whole thing a non-starter. So the stalking horse idea is not a bad one, but it's just not an entirely credible threat right now. So it's probably not going to mean much in practice. But points for trying. They're making an effort here. This is what happens when you don't have a lot of chips to play. Now let's see, there's an election coming up in Australia. It's going to be Albanese versus Dutton, if I'm not mistaken. I don't have a lot of details besides. Let's see, South Asia, Afghanistan, yeah. Not really much else. We could get into China, but it would probably take more time than we have left here. What are we talking, 10 minutes, something like that?
Yeah, 10, 15.
Oh, are you in game?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Gotcha. All right, a little more time. I did have an interesting note about North America, I guess specifically the United States. So this has to do with U.S. agriculture. So U.S. agriculture is pretty dominant. The U.S. is a major exporter. The U.S. has some of the most efficient, productive farms on the planet, yada, yada, yada. Everybody kind of knows that. So it might surprise you to know that the agricultural sector in the United States has been in a state of recession roughly for, 3 years now? For some time. They've been getting squeezed badly by a combination of factors. For one, low crop prices. Prices have fallen off partly because of trade wars of one kind or another. I guess that would be the main reason. Also because the economy, the global economy since the pandemic has not been great. It's actually kind of stagnant. It's flitted between stagnation and mild growth. And so the result of that is that global agricultural prices are not that great right now. They've peaked at certain times, but mostly that has to do with disruption and supply stemming from the war in Ukraine. Beyond that, for the most part, global prices are not doing well. And so that in turn has hurt farmers in the United States, whom again are major exporters. So when the global market doesn't do well, U.S. farmers tend to struggle as a result. Another problem facing U.S. agriculture, high interest rates. Interest rates in the United States are not really that high in historical terms, but they have gone up pretty significantly since 2020. And because a lot of the stuff that farmers use as inputs is bought using debt, they feel the higher price of that debt in the form of the higher interest rates that they have to pay in order to get it. So that in turn has resulted in greater costs and in turn has squeezed profits. And then, of course, just inflation generally, higher costs for seeds, fertilizer, labor, all of that has pinched farms' profits as well. So altogether, between low prices, high costs, and high interest rates, American farms have really been struggling financially for the past couple years. The specific data point I have from the USDA is that farm income has dropped 23% since 2022. And this is actually one of the biggest declines in the history of the United States. So that may have gone under a lot of people's radar, since of course everybody's kind of focused more on the cities where most of the economic growth is, inflation, eggs, things like that. But if you actually look at rural America, they've actually been hurting pretty badly for a while now. And I think with all of the other drama going on, that has maybe gone unnoticed.
Well, that might be a big part of why there's been such a swing in sentiment in favor of Trump and why he won, is if the rural population is traditionally represented by the Republican vote, and he is not only running under that ticket, he's speaking kind of a big game in their direction in a way that they understand and enjoy, then yeah, he's going to win a lot of hearts and minds in rural America.
Well, the political loyalties of rural America were not really in dispute. They were always going to vote GOP. They could have run anybody. They could have run, what's his name? DeSantis. Would have been the same thing. Like anybody the GOP won would almost certainly get rural America's vote, because the Democrats just do not cater to that particular constituency virtually at all.
Gotcha.
Even a lot of Democrat strategists have complained about that. They say that the Democratic Party, by way of its political strategy over the past couple decades, has de facto conceded the entirety of rural America to the Republican Party, to the point where it's basically been uncontested for a generation now. Still going?
Yep. There was one question about, what was it, protests in Turkey or something?
Protests in Turkey. I mean, more of the same, pretty much. I haven't heard anything new, really. I know that the government has issued a lot of threats against the protesters, saying that they're just trying to disrupt public order, etc., but no other big changes. I don't know that the government is going to really give ground here. They don't really have to. They still retain enough popular support that they can get away without making any substantive concessions. But the protesters, to their credit, have been keeping it up. There was a big one, I think, 100,000 strong, roughly, in Istanbul this past weekend. So they haven't given up, but I don't really know what the plan is.
It's a pretty huge protest.
Yeah. It's a surprisingly large country, Turkey. It's, I think, up to 80 million people now, if I'm not mistaken.
You're saying Erdogan arrested the main rival for the presidency? I think you mentioned that previously.
Yeah, that's kind of the gist of it. The main opposition party, the CHP, had a guy who successfully beat the AKP for the mayoral office of Istanbul, the largest and most important city in Turkey. And so they were about to announce that he would be their presidential nominee for the election coming up. And I think a couple days before they were set to make that announcement, he was arrested by the government on some probably fabricated charges about the nature of his college degree, which is actually a prerequisite to holding office in Turkey.
He didn't go to college. He can't be president. How's Australia's economy been doing?
It's been feeling more pressure recently. That global wave of inflation hit them too. And then the global economy not being as hot, and in particular the Chinese economy suffering, has had an impact on them. I don't think they're in recession, but they're not growing nearly as fast as they used to. There was a long, unbroken period of economic growth for Australia that ran roughly from, I want to say, like the late 90s, early aughts, up until maybe up until the pandemic, let's say. And a lot of that was generated by economic growth in China, where they were importing a lot of minerals. Australia has a big mining sector, and so as the Chinese economy grew, they imported more and more of the minerals that were being mined in Australia. And that helped power the Australian economy through economic historical events that were very negative for most everybody else. But Australia was not as badly impacted, to the point where they just didn't have really a down economic year for the better part of, 20-some years. Very strong record for them in that period. Didn't make their politics any more stable. They had kind of a revolving door of leaders for a good chunk of that. But the pandemic kind of put an end to it. And since China's economy has started, maybe not stagnating, but since its growth is not nearly as high, the Australian mining sector isn't doing as well. And so that in turn, that's kind of put a crimp on things in Australia. And people, of course, complain bitterly about, things like inflation, energy costs, etc.
Do Australians buy their automobiles from China or US? Or I guess Japan?
It's a good question. I don't really know how the market share pans out. I would guess American. I think their tastes are a little more American in terms of the vehicles they prefer.
Mm-hmm.
But Americans also don't make cheap cars, so probably it's going to be something like 20 Japanese, German, American.
Gotcha.
I would guess off the top of my head. And then just sort of a smattering of other producers.
I thought in my head,
China does.
Australia is
Sorry,
basically just ocean Texas, so whatever vehicles go well in Texas.
Yeah, there's a lot of cultural similarities in many ways. But what was I trying to think of? Slips my mind. Probably wasn't important.
We have a lot of Australian and German regulars. Oh, random country. How's Greece doing?
It's been a lot quieter. Yeah, their sort of high point was Syriza. They really thought maybe they kind of had a chance to break out of the whole Eurozone crisis with Syriza, but that failed for reasons that are a little complicated to get into in the few minutes we have left. But after that, after Syriza failed, there was another election, and then they elected a center-right government. And as far as I know, they've pretty much just been in power for the past 10 years, if I'm not mistaken. Has it really been that long already? Yeah, they haven't been in the news nearly as much the past 5-some years, so I'm not as familiar with what's going on there. I do know that the economy there has improved over the past 10 years. There's still been a major outflow of people. There's a lot of emigration, but the economy has stabilized at least. So it's not nearly as bad as it was during the Eurozone crisis. Although I guess that's a pretty low bar. Let's see.
Was there a Musk, Wisconsin thing?
Yeah, there was like something about him paying people to vote for Trump. Something like $1 million per vote.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't followed up on that too much, so I'm not familiar with the details.
$1 million per vote? That's quite a bit of money for a vote. Sheesh.
Yeah, he's getting sued for that, and I think the court in Wisconsin said that the payments could go forward. That's not a resolution. The case is still going to continue, but the question was whether or not the court will put a hold on the payments. And the court did decide to allow the payments to go forward.
That's kind of silly. So this is against the law, but we're going to let you do this.
Well, that's the era. The era in a nutshell. Okay, Syriza, 290, 2015. Mitsotakis, 2023. Oh, yeah. So Syriza was around until 2019, then center-right starting in 2019 up until the present. Fair enough.
The old Marcus Crassus routine. That sounds like a Roman. Well, cool. I think we about knocked out the questions, unless you had any last-second funny shit that happened. The group text is pretty funny. That's probably the funniest thing of the week so far. Detailed military battle plans, just randomly roped in a against the current administration journalist. Whoops.
There's some stuff, but nothing I can remember off the top of my head.
What have you been gaming?
I wanted to do Baldur's Gate 3, since you kind of piqued my interest in it with our last couple playthroughs, but I'd forgotten how poorly my computer handles Act 3. That is an ongoing problem. So I figured I'd save myself some grief, and instead of doing BG3, I actually started up Pillars of Eternity, which is a similar type of CRPG. I'd started playing it a while ago, but it was before I was familiar with some of the rules of that style of game. Having played through BG3, I'm much more well-versed in how those systems work. So I figured starting it again, I'd be way more proficient and have less of an uphill battle. Thus far, I've been right, and it has been fun.
Nice. Did you have a solo run that you were playing in BG3?
Oh, I've had several. I think I've only finished one of them fully. And my party died to a bear.
Oh no.
Very embarrassing. And then last night, the whole party got wiped by a single trap because I was being dumb and not sneaking around to see if there were any around. Whoops.
Was that a knockback one? Those are the worst, where it knocks you off a cliff.
No, it just burned us all to death.
Oh no. Call the fire department.
Yeah. I did start up Mecha Bellum, but I haven't finished the tutorial yet.
Nice. That game's very fun. I would think that that's a more easily playable game on an older computer.
Oh yeah, that's the impression I got as well. Now, is that purely a multiplayer game, or is there a single-player mode?
There are lots of single-player modes. When I was first playing the game, I think I played survival mode the most, where it escalates the opponent more and more over time, which ends up being a similar vibe to fighting a human player, but you don't need another person. So you don't have to worry about the matchmaking. When I started 1v1 in Mechabellum, I think I lost my first 9 rounds. Just because there's a lot to learn about what to put stuff where, and some people watch streamers and stuff who play it all the time, so they know like the meta builds of which mechs are really good right now and that kind of thing.
Gotcha. So I have a learning curve to look forward to.
Yeah, but you don't have to get punished for that if you play single player, because you get to just ramp up through the normal system.
Oh, sure, it's not a problem. But I can tell, even going through the tutorial, there's a lot of different moving parts that I'm going to have to remember.
That is a big true. Well, let me know if you tried and what your feeling is about it, because I thought it was very fun.
Yeah, I'm getting into it. Just got to get over the hump here first.
The first time getting into it is usually annoying, because you have to deliberately figure out where everything is and how to achieve your desired outcome.
I've also been playing HOTS, but that's pretty normal.
I played some on Friday, actually.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, because I wanted to install a game on Steam. I think I was going to play Space Marine with my brother, so I didn't want to be running another Steam game just to try to give it a chance to go faster, so I played HOTS instead. And I think I played Anubarak the most. He's fun. He's very tanky, and he's Zerg-like, and he has a pretty cool mobility option with his burrow under the ground ability. You can use that for offense or defense.
Yeah, he can be very annoying in the right hands. I've definitely been stun-killed by a number of Anubaraks over time.
What characters do you play?
It's pretty much just Medivh. Yeah, I'm not a big MOBA guy, but Medivh has a unique enough design philosophy that kind of keeps me interested. So I just solo QM him, which is very masochistic of me. The solo QM is a kind of hell. Have you broken 20 yet?
I'm close. I think I'm level 19. That's part of the reason why I played Anubarak, was because I wanted to play a character with bonus XP. Because I fall into the trap of I play Tyrande all the time. But if you have a higher level character, it's harder to get the next level. But if you have a level 1 character, you win one time, and I think you get 2 levels. So I just need to play a couple of the bonus ones.
Nice. So you're almost there. You're going to unlock a whole bunch of stuff soon.
Yeah, I'm excited for that. I'll get a bundle. I think I'll go for the Assassin's bundle.
Yeah, I figure you're more for an assassin than a tank or a support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I played a tank in WoW, so I know the vantage point, and it's fun. But I like the damage dealing. When I play Dota, I tend to play carry and play agility carries that usually deal a lot of damage, but they're a backliner and they have to wait for the fight to start.
Yeah. Yeah, you'll probably like Illidan. That seems to be more your speed, I think.
Mm-hmm. Illidan, Sylvanas, Valera, stuff like that. Give me any of the flippy elves, and I'm good to go.
There you go.
Well, cool. I think we'll call it there and maybe do some BG3 of our own if you're down.
Definitely down if you are.
Cool. Well, thank you, chat, for your interest. Thank you, Fuzzy Coat, for handling questions, and Agent Smith for your time. And we will see you on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yep. Thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.